250 million years before the first human being ever drew breath, before the first flower ever bloomed, before the first bird ever took wing, and long before the mighty dinosaurs ever shook the earth beneath their colossal feet, there existed a world so alien, so breathtakingly strange, that it would be almost unrecognizable to modern eyes. And yet this world was our world. This was Earth, the same planet that you and I call home. But it belonged to a completely different dynasty of rulers, creatures whose names have been largely forgotten by popular culture, overshadowed by the spectacular fame of the dinosaurs that came after them. These were the true pioneers of terrestrial dominance. These were the original lords of the land. They built the first complex ecosystems on solid ground. They developed the first sophisticated hunting strategies. They evolved the first warm-blooded metabolisms. They were, in every sense that matters, the architects of the biological world that would eventually give rise to everything that followed, including, ultimately, us. This is their story. This is the story of the forgotten rulers of Earth, the creatures that dominated our planet for tens of millions of years before a catastrophe of almost unimaginable proportions wiped nearly all of them from existence, clearing the stage for an entirely new cast of characters. It is a story of innovation and adaptation, of predators and prey locked in evolutionary arms races that push the boundaries of biological possibility. It is a story of a single, vast supercontinent where life flourished in forms that defy easy categorization. And it is a story that ends with the single most devastating event in the entire history of life on this planet, a mass extinction so thorough, so merciless, that it came within a razor's edge of ending the story of complex life altogether. Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it, and be sure to subscribe to the channel for future videos. Now, let us travel back. Let us journey across an abyss of time so vast that the human mind can barely comprehend it. Let us go back to a world without borders, a world without the familiar continents we know today, a world where every landmass on the planet was fused together into one single, enormous supercontinent. Let us go back to the age before the dinosaurs. Let us go back to the Permian. Imagine standing on a high ridge of bare rock, looking out across a landscape that stretches to the horizon in every direction. There is no grass beneath your feet because grass has not yet evolved. There are no flowers anywhere because flowering plants will not appear for another 170 million years. The trees, if you can call them trees, are strange and unfamiliar. They are not the oaks and maples and pines that clothe the modern world. Instead, they are primitive conifers with thick, scaly bark, seed ferns with enormous fronds, and towering lycopsids, ancient relatives of the tiny club mosses that carpet forest floors today. The air smells different. It is thick and warm and carries a faint sulfurous tang from distant volcanic vents. The sky above is hazy, tinged with a color that is not quite the blue you are accustomed to. The sun blazes down with fierce intensity, heating the bare rock and dry soil until the ground shimmers with convection currents. This is the world of the Permian period, roughly 290 million years ago. And the first thing you would notice, the very first thing that would strike you about this world, is the sheer, overwhelming scale of the land. Because this is Pangaea, the supercontinent, and it is unlike anything that exists in the modern world. Every continent you have ever known, every landmass you have ever seen on a map, was, during this time, joined together into a single, colossal body of land that stretched from pole to pole. Pangaea was not just large, it was almost incomprehensibly vast. You could have walked from what would one day become the frozen tundra of Siberia all the way down to what would eventually become the southernmost tip of Africa without ever crossing a single ocean. You could have traveled from the future site of the Appalachian Mountains to the future location of the Ural Mountains without getting your feet wet. The entire terrestrial surface of the planet was, essentially, one piece, and this single, unified landmass created conditions that were profoundly different from anything the modern world experiences. The interior of Pangaea was a place of extremes. Because it was so far from the moderating influence of the oceans, the heartland of the supercontinent experienced temperature swings that would be devastating to most modern ecosystems. Summers were brutally hot, with temperatures soaring well above anything recorded in modern deserts. Winters, particularly in the higher latitudes, could be bitterly cold. Rainfall was erratic and unevenly distributed. The coastal regions received moisture from the surrounding ocean, a vast global sea known as Panthalassa, but the deep interior of the continent was arid, a sprawling expanse of desert and semi-desert that made the modern Sahara look modest by comparison. And yet life thrived. Life, as it always does, found a way. Along the coasts and river valleys, in the floodplains and deltas, in the swamps and lakeshores, communities of organisms had established themselves in configurations that were startlingly complex. These were not simple, primitive ecosystems. These were fully developed food webs with multiple trophic levels, with apex predators and herbivores and scavengers and decomposers, all interlocking in a web of relationships as intricate and interdependent as anything found in the modern world. The difference was that the players, the actual organisms filling these roles, were utterly unlike the creatures we know today. This was a world before mammals, before birds, before lizards and snakes and turtles, before crocodiles in any form we would recognize. The dominant land animals of the Permian belonged to groups that have no direct modern equivalent, groups whose names are known only to paleontologists and whose appearances challenge our assumptions about what is possible in vertebrate evolution. And at the very top of this ancient world's hierarchy, sitting unchallenged at the apex of the food chain, were the synapsids. The synapsids. This is a name that most people have never heard, and yet it is a name of profound importance. Because the synapsids were not just another group of prehistoric animals, they were the first group of land vertebrates to achieve true dominance over terrestrial ecosystems. They were the first to develop complex social behaviors, the first to evolve differentiated teeth for processing different types of food, the first to begin the long, slow evolutionary march toward warm-bloodedness, and they are our ancestors. Every mammal alive today, from the smallest shrew to the largest whale, from the bat in the attic to the elephant on the savanna, is a descendant of these Permian synapsids. We are their legacy, we carry their genes, and the story of their rise and fall is, in a very real sense, the first chapter of our own story. But let us not get ahead of ourselves. Let us start at the beginning. Let us start with the world as it was before the synapsids rose to power, and let us trace the chain of events that led to their extraordinary reign. The story of life on land is, in evolutionary terms, a relatively recent one. For the vast majority of Earth's history, the continents were barren, lifeless expanses of rock and sand. Life was confined to the oceans, where it had originated billions of years earlier in the warm, shallow seas of the young planet. For eon upon eon, the sea was the only arena that mattered. Every major innovation in the history of life, from the first single-celled organisms to the first multicellular creatures, from the first animals with hard shells to the first creatures with backbones, all of these milestones took place underwater. The colonization of the land was a slow, halting process that began with the simplest of organisms. First came the bacteria and algae, creeping up from tidal pools to colonize moist rocks near the water's edge. Then came the mosses and liverworts, primitive plants that hugged the ground and required constant moisture to reproduce. Then came the vascular plants, with their internal plumbing systems that could transport water from roots to leaves, allowing them to grow taller and colonize drier environments. The first forests appeared in the Devonian period, roughly 380 million years ago, and they transformed the land forever, creating shade and soil and habitat and food for the animals that would follow them onto dry ground. The first vertebrates to venture onto land were the tetrapods, four-limbed creatures that evolved from lobe-finned fish in the swamps and shallows of the Devonian. These early pioneers were clumsy, slow, and thoroughly dependent on water. They had to return to streams and ponds to lay their eggs, just as modern amphibians do. They breathed through simple lungs and through their moist skin. They could venture onto land for brief periods to bask in the sun or to escape aquatic predators, but they could not survive far from water. They were visitors to the terrestrial world, not residents. But evolution is relentless, and over millions of years, some lineages of tetrapods developed adaptations that allowed them to sever their dependence on water. The single most important of these adaptations was the amniotic egg, a self-contained life support system enclosed in a tough, waterproof shell. Inside this shell, the developing embryo was bathed in its own private pond, a fluid-filled sac called the amnion that provided protection, moisture, and nutrients. The amniotic egg was one of the most revolutionary innovations in the history of life. It freed vertebrates from the tyranny of the waterside. It allowed them to reproduce anywhere on land, to colonize the deep interior of continents, to exploit habitats that had been completely inaccessible to their amphibian ancestors. The first amniotes appeared in the Carboniferous period, roughly 312 million years ago. They were small, lizard-like creatures, probably insectivorous, probably nocturnal, probably utterly unremarkable in appearance. But they carried within them the seeds of future greatness, because very early in their evolutionary history, the amniotes split into two great lineages, two fundamentally different branches of the family tree that would go on to dominate the land in alternating succession for the next 300 million years. One branch led to the sauropsids, the lineage that would eventually produce the reptiles, the dinosaurs, and the birds. The other branch led to the synapsids, the lineage that would eventually produce the mammals. And here is the crucial point, the fact that overturns so many of our assumptions about the history of life on Earth. It was not the sauropsid line, the reptile line, that rose to dominance first. It was the synapsid line. The ancestors of mammals ruled the Earth long before the ancestors of dinosaurs even existed as a distinct group. The age of the synapsids came first, and it lasted for tens of millions of years. The earliest synapsids appeared in the late Carboniferous, roughly 306 million years ago. They are identified by a single, seemingly minor anatomical feature, a hole in the skull behind each eye, called the temporal fenestra. In early forms, this hole was small and apparently insignificant, but it was the anchor point for jaw muscles, and over time, as the synapsid lineage evolved, these muscles would become larger and more powerful, passing through and around the temporal fenestra, giving synapsids a bite force and a jaw sophistication that their competitors simply could not match. The earliest synapsids were small and generalized, similar in many ways to the other early amniotes that shared their world. But they diversified rapidly, filling a range of ecological roles with remarkable speed. Some became herbivores, developing broad, crushing teeth for processing tough plant material. Others became carnivores, evolving sharp, piercing teeth and powerful jaws for catching and killing prey. Others became omnivores, opportunistic feeders that exploited whatever food sources were available. And as the Carboniferous gave way to the Permian, roughly 299 million years ago, the synapsids underwent an explosive radiation that would establish them as the undisputed rulers of the land. The Permian world was their world, and the creature that best exemplifies their early dominance, the animal that has become the iconic symbol of this pre-dinosaurian age, is one that most people have seen in books or museums without ever fully understanding what it was. That creature is Dimetrodon. Dimetrodon. The name means 2 measures of teeth, a reference to the fact that this animal had 2 distinct types of teeth in its jaws, a feature that was revolutionary for its time. Most early reptiles and amphibians had mouths full of identical teeth, simple, peg-like structures that were good for grabbing but not much else. Dimetrodon had something different. It had large, sharp canine-like teeth at the front of its jaws for piercing and gripping prey, and smaller, serrated teeth behind them for slicing flesh. This differentiation of teeth, a condition called heterodonty, was a major evolutionary advance. It allowed Dimetrodon to process its food more efficiently than animals with simple, uniform teeth, and it foreshadowed the even more complex tooth arrangements that would eventually appear in later synapsids and, ultimately, in mammals. But the teeth are not what most people notice first when they see a Dimetrodon. What they notice is the sail. Rising from Dimetrodon's back, supported by enormously elongated spines extending from its vertebrae, was a spectacular semicircular sail of skin that could reach heights of over a meter in the largest individuals. This sail is one of the most visually striking structures in the entire fossil record, and it has been the subject of intense scientific debate for over a century. What was it for? Why would a predator evolve such an apparently cumbersome and conspicuous structure? The most widely accepted explanation is thermoregulation. Dimetrodon, like all early synapsids, was almost certainly ectothermic, meaning it depended on external sources of heat to regulate its body temperature. In the Permian world, where temperatures could fluctuate dramatically between day and night and between seasons, the ability to warm up quickly in the morning and cool down efficiently during the heat of the day would have been a tremendous advantage. The sail, with its dense network of blood vessels, functioned like a biological solar panel. In the morning, when the animal was cold and sluggish from the cool night, it could orient its sail broadside to the sun, exposing the maximum surface area to solar radiation. Blood flowing through the sail would be warmed by the sun and then circulated through the body, raising the animal's core temperature far more quickly than would be possible for a similar-sized animal without a sail. This might sound like a modest advantage, but in evolutionary terms, it was enormous. A predator that could warm up faster than its prey had a devastating tactical edge. While its victims were still cold and slow, still waiting for the sun to warm their bodies to operating temperature, Dimetrodon was already active, already hunting, already lethal. In the cool hours of the early morning, when other large animals were essentially immobilized by the cold, Dimetrodon was the undisputed master of the landscape, and it was a formidable master indeed. Dimetrodon was the largest predator in its ecosystem, reaching lengths of up to 4.5 meters and weights of over 250 kilograms in the largest species. It walked on four sprawling legs, its body held low to the ground in the characteristic posture of early synapsids, a posture quite different from the upright stance of later, more advanced members of the group. Its skull was large and deep, housing powerful jaw muscles that could deliver a crushing, bone-breaking bite. Its eyes were positioned forward on its skull, giving it binocular vision and excellent depth perception, essential tools for a predator that needed to judge distances accurately when striking at prey. Now, it is critically important to understand something about Dimetrodon that many people get wrong. Dimetrodon was not a dinosaur. It was not even a reptile, at least not in the way that most people understand the term. Dimetrodon was a synapsid, a member of the lineage that would eventually give rise to mammals. It is more closely related to you, the person watching this documentary right now, than it is to any dinosaur that ever lived. When you look at a picture of Dimetrodon, you are looking at a distant relative, a great-great-grandparent of sorts, separated from you by roughly 300 million years of evolution, but connected to you by an unbroken chain of descent. This is one of the most commonly misunderstood facts in paleontology. Dimetrodon appears in children's dinosaur books. It is sold as part of dinosaur toy sets. It is featured in dinosaur-themed movies and television shows. But it lived and died tens of millions of years before the first dinosaur ever appeared on Earth. It belongs to an entirely different chapter of the story of life, a chapter that is often overlooked, often misrepresented, and rarely given the attention it deserves. Dimetrodon prowled the floodplains and river valleys of equatorial Pangaea during the early to middle Permian, roughly 295 to 272 million years ago. Its world was a patchwork of wet and dry environments, with lush vegetation growing along waterways and open, arid terrain stretching between them. The climate was seasonal, with wet periods that brought flooding and green growth alternating with dry spells that turned the landscape brown and parched. In this world, Dimetrodon was the apex predator, the top of the food chain, the creature that all other animals feared. Its diet likely included a wide range of prey. It would have hunted other synapsids, particularly the herbivorous cassaids and edificaurids that shared its habitat. It probably also took large amphibians, which were still abundant in and around the waterways. It may have scavenged when the opportunity arose, using its powerful jaws to crack open bones and access the rich marrow inside. And it likely engaged in territorial behavior, defending prime hunting grounds against rivals of its own species. But Dimetrodon was not alone at the top. The Permian food web was complex and dynamic, with multiple predatory species occupying different niches within the ecosystem. And to understand how these food webs functioned, we need to look beyond Dimetrodon and examine the broader community of organisms that made up the Permian world. Let us start with the herbivores, because every predator depends, ultimately, on the plant eaters that form the base of the animal food chain. The most abundant large herbivores in the early Permian were the cassaids, a group of synapsids that had evolved to exploit the vast quantities of plant material available in the Permian landscape. Cassaids were barrel-bodied, small-headed creatures that looked somewhat like oversized, bloated lizards. The largest species, such as Cotylohynchus, could reach lengths of over 6 meters and weights of several hundred kilograms, making them among the largest land animals of their time. Their bodies were designed for one purpose, processing enormous quantities of low-quality plant food. They had small heads with leaf-shaped teeth for cropping vegetation, enormous barrel-shaped rib cages that housed vast fermentation chamber guts for breaking down tough plant fibers, and short, sturdy legs for supporting their considerable bulk. Cassaids were not graceful animals. They were slow, ponderous, and probably not particularly intelligent, but they did not need to be. Their strategy was one of bulk and endurance. They spent their days methodically cropping and chewing vegetation, consuming vast quantities of ferns, seed plants, and other Permian flora, extracting what nutrients they could through prolonged fermentation in their enormous digestive systems. They were the Permian equivalent of modern cattle or elephants, large-bodied, slow-moving herbivores that shaped their environments through their sheer consumption of plant material. And like modern large herbivores, they were the primary prey of the apex predators. Dimetrodon almost certainly hunted cassaids, targeting the young, the old, and the infirm, just as modern predators focus on the most vulnerable members of a herd. A healthy, full-grown Cotylohynchus would have been a formidable target, too large and powerful for even a large Dimetrodon to take down easily. But a young cassaid, separated from the group and still small enough to be manageable, would have been an irresistible meal. Another important group of early Permian herbivores were the edificaurids, close relatives of Dimetrodon that had evolved in a very different direction. Like Dimetrodon, many edificaurids had tall sails on their backs, but their sails were adorned with crossbars or tubercles that gave them a distinctly different appearance. And unlike the meat-eating Dimetrodon, edificaurids were herbivores with peg-like teeth adapted for crushing plant material. Edaphosaurus, the best-known member of this group, was a medium-sized animal, reaching lengths of about 3.5 meters. It was a common component of early Permian ecosystems, often found in the same habitats as Dimetrodon, and it undoubtedly featured prominently on the predator's menu. The relationship between Dimetrodon and its herbivorous prey mirrors patterns that we see repeated throughout the history of life on Earth. Predators and prey are locked in a perpetual evolutionary arms race, each side constantly evolving new strategies to outcompete the other. The herbivores evolve larger body sizes, thicker hides, sharper horns, faster legs, keener senses. The predators evolve stronger jaws, sharper teeth, more efficient locomotion, better hunting strategies. Neither side ever achieves a permanent advantage, because any new adaptation by one side immediately creates selective pressure for a counter-adaptation by the other. This dynamic tension, this endless back and forth of evolutionary innovation, is one of the primary engines driving the diversification of life, and in the Permian, this engine was running at full throttle. The synapsids were diversifying at an extraordinary rate, filling ecological niches with a speed and creativity that was remarkable even by the standards of vertebrate evolution. And as the early Permian gave way to the middle and late Permian, a new group of synapsids began to emerge that would take this diversification to an entirely new level. They were called the therapsids. The therapsids were the next great chapter in the synapsid story, and their evolution represents one of the most important transitions in the entire history of vertebrate life. Because the therapsids were the group that would eventually give rise to mammals, and in their anatomy, their physiology, and their behavior, we can see the first glimmers of the characteristics that would come to define the mammalian body plan. The transition from the early, sprawling synapsids like Dimetrodon to the more advanced therapsids was not a sudden event. It was a gradual process that played out over millions of years, driven by the relentless pressures of natural selection. But the changes, when they came, were profound. The first and most obvious change was in posture. Early synapsids like Dimetrodon walked with a sprawling gait, their legs splayed out to the sides of their bodies, their bellies close to the ground. This posture, while adequate for short bursts of activity, was inherently inefficient for sustained locomotion. It required considerable muscular effort just to hold the body off the ground, and it limited the animal's stamina and speed. The therapsids began to change this. Over successive generations, their limbs gradually rotated inward, shifting from a sprawling position to a more upright, parasagittal stance. The hind limbs in particular became increasingly vertical, positioned more directly beneath the body rather than sticking out to the sides. This shift had enormous implications for locomotion. An animal with upright limbs expends far less energy on simply supporting its body weight, freeing up metabolic resources for other activities. It can walk and run more efficiently, covering greater distances with less effort. It can sustain higher speeds for longer periods. In short, an upright posture made therapsids more effective movers, better hunters, and more elusive prey. But the postural changes were just the beginning. The therapsids also underwent major modifications to their skulls and jaws, changes that would have far-reaching consequences for their ability to process food and ultimately for their metabolic capabilities. The temporal fenestra, that simple hole in the skull behind the eye that had defined the synapsid lineage from its earliest days, became progressively larger in the therapsids. This enlargement allowed for the attachment of bigger, more powerful jaw muscles, giving therapsids a bite force that far exceeded that of their ancestors. More importantly, the configuration of the jaw itself began to change. Early synapsids, the lower jaw was composed of multiple bones, a primitive arrangement inherited from their fish ancestors. In the therapsids, one of these bones, the dentary, began to enlarge at the expense of the others. Over millions of years, the dentary grew larger and larger, eventually coming to dominate the lower jaw, while the other bones shrank and eventually migrated to a new location and a new function entirely. This is one of the most remarkable stories in all of evolutionary biology. The bones that once formed the back of the reptilian jaw gradually shrank, migrated, and were repurposed to become the tiny bones of the mammalian middle ear. The very bones that your ancestors once used to bite and chew are now, in your own head, functioning as part of your hearing apparatus, transmitting sound vibrations from your eardrum to your inner ear. It is a transformation so improbable, so seemingly impossible, that it would strain credulity if it were not so thoroughly documented in the fossil record, but we are getting ahead of ourselves. In the Middle Permian, this transformation was only just beginning. The therapsids of this period still had multi-bone jaws, still had relatively primitive ear structures, but they were already beginning to diverge from the earlier synapsid body plan in ways that would prove decisive. Among the most impressive of the early therapsids were the dinosaurs, whose name means terrible heads, a fitting label for animals that possessed some of the most massive and heavily built skulls of any land animal in the history of life. The dinosaurs were a diverse group that included both carnivores and herbivores, and they dominated the Middle Permian ecosystems with an authority that echoed the earlier reign of Dimetrodon, but on an even grander scale. The herbivorous dinosaurs, such as mosscops, were truly enormous creatures. Mosscops could reach lengths of 5 meters and weights of well over 1,000 kilograms, making it one of the largest land animals the world had seen up to that point. It had a massive, thick-boned skull that may have been used in head-butting contests between rival males, much like modern bighorn sheep or musk oxen. Its body was barrel-shaped and powerfully built, supported by stout, semi-upright legs that gave it a stance somewhere between the sprawl of Dimetrodon and the fully upright posture of later therapsids. Mosscops was a dedicated herbivore, feeding on the tough, fibrous vegetation of the Middle Permian, and it lived in herds that may have numbered in the dozens or even hundreds. The carnivorous dinosaurs were equally impressive. Ankylosaurus, one of the largest predatory therapsids, was a formidable hunter that could reach lengths of 5 to 6 meters. It had a long, powerful skull filled with large, interlocking teeth, and its body was built for explosive, short-range attacks on large prey. Ankylosaurus probably hunted mosscops and other large herbivores, ambushing them at water holes or catching them in the open when they were separated from the herd. The dinosaurs represented a peak in therapsid evolution, a moment when the synapsid lineage achieved a level of dominance and diversity that would not be seen again until the rise of the mammals tens of millions of years later. They were the undisputed rulers of the Middle Permian world, occupying every major ecological niche from top predator to mega herbivore. And they demonstrate a crucial point about the nature of evolutionary dominance. The animals that ruled the earth before the dinosaurs were not primitive, not simple, not inferior. They were sophisticated, successful, and supremely well adapted to their world, but the dinosaurs' reign was relatively brief, at least in geological terms. By the late Middle Permian, roughly 260 million years ago, the dinosaurs had largely disappeared, replaced by a new wave of therapsid groups that were even more advanced, even more diverse, and even more mammal-like in their characteristics. The reasons for the dinosaurs' decline are not entirely clear. There is evidence of significant environmental changes during this period, including shifts in climate and vegetation patterns that may have disrupted the ecosystems on which the dinosaurs depended. There may also have been competitive pressure from newer, more efficient therapsid groups that were better adapted to the changing conditions. Whatever the cause, the dinosaurs faded, and their place was taken by an array of remarkable creatures that would define the final chapter of the pre-dinosaurian world. Among the most important of these successor groups were the gorgonopsians, a group of carnivorous therapsids that represent perhaps the most terrifying predators the Permian world ever produced. The gorgonopsians were named after the Gorgons of Greek mythology, those fearsome creatures whose gaze could turn a person to stone. And while the real gorgonopsians could not literally petrify their victims, they were no less fearsome. These were dedicated, specialized killing machines, optimized by millions of years of evolution for one purpose: catching and killing large prey. The most striking feature of the gorgonopsians was their teeth. Like Dimetrodon before them, the gorgonopsians had differentiated dentition, with distinct types of teeth serving different functions. But the gorgonopsians took this specialization to an extreme. Their canine teeth, the large, piercing fangs at the front of the upper jaw, were enormous, extending well below the lower jaw in some species, and giving these animals a distinctly saber-toothed appearance. In the largest gorgonopsians, such as Inostrancevia, these canines could be 12 centimeters long or more, serrated along their edges for slicing through flesh and hide. Inostrancevia itself was a monster by any standard. Reaching lengths of over 3.5 meters, with a skull nearly 60 centimeters long, it was the apex predator of the late Permian ecosystems of what would one day become the northern reaches of the supercontinent. It was built for power rather than speed, with a robust body, strong limbs, and a massive skull that could deliver devastating bites. When Inostrancevia closed its jaws on prey, those enormous canines would have driven deep into the victim's flesh, piercing vital organs and blood vessels, causing rapid blood loss and shock. It was a killing technique not unlike that of the much later saber-toothed cats, and it was devastatingly effective against the large herbivores that formed the bulk of Inostrancevia diet. But Inostrancevia was not the only gorgonopsian, nor was it the only predator in the late Permian ecosystem. The gorgonopsians as a group were remarkably diverse, with species ranging in size from relatively small, dog-sized hunters to the giant Inostrancevia. They occupied a range of predatory niches, from ambush hunters that lurked in dense vegetation to more active pursuers that chased down prey in the open, and they were not alone at the top of the food chain. Alongside the gorgonopsians, other groups of predatory therapsids were also diversifying, creating a competitive landscape of carnivores that was as complex and dynamic as any modern ecosystem. One of these groups was the Dinosaurs, a diverse and ecologically important group of therapsids that ranged from small, insectivorous forms to medium-sized predators. The Dinosaurs were more advanced than the gorgonopsians in some respects, with more sophisticated jaw mechanics and, in some cases, evidence of secondary palates, bony shelves that separated the nasal passages from the mouth cavity. This is a feature of enormous significance, because a secondary palate allows an animal to breathe and eat at the same time, something that animals without secondary palates cannot do. In a more primitive skull, the air passage and the food passage share the same space in the mouth, meaning that the animal must stop breathing every time it chews and swallows. A secondary palate eliminates this problem by creating a separate channel for air, allowing continuous breathing regardless of what the mouth is doing. Why does this matter? Because continuous breathing is a prerequisite for a high metabolic rate. An animal that has to stop breathing every time it eats cannot sustain the kind of continuous, high-energy metabolism that characterizes warm-blooded animals. The evolution of the secondary palate in the Dinosaurs is therefore a powerful piece of evidence suggesting that at least some late Permian therapsids were beginning to develop elevated metabolic rates, taking the first steps toward the warm-bloodedness that would eventually become a defining characteristic of mammals. And the Dinosaurs were not the only therapsids moving in this direction. Another group, the cynodonts, was evolving along a parallel track, developing a suite of mammal-like features that would eventually, over tens of millions of years of further refinement, give rise to the first true mammals. The cynodonts were perhaps the most mammal-like of all the Permian therapsids. They had fully differentiated teeth, with incisors, canines, and complex, multi-cusped cheek teeth for processing food efficiently. They had enlarged dentary bones that dominated the lower jaw. They had well-developed secondary palates. They had evidence of whisker pits on their snouts, suggesting that they possessed vibrancy, the sensory whiskers that are a hallmark of modern mammals. And perhaps most remarkably, some cynodonts show evidence of having had fur. Think about what that implies. Fur is an insulating material. Its primary function is to retain body heat. An animal that has fur is an animal that produces its own body heat and needs to keep that heat from escaping. In other words, an animal with fur is an animal that is, at least to some degree, warm-blooded. The evidence for fur in Permian cynodonts is indirect but compelling. The whisker pits on the snouts of some species indicate the presence of specialized hairs, and where there are specialized hairs, there are likely to be general body hairs as well. Additionally, the bone microstructure of many cynodonts shows patterns of rapid, sustained growth that are characteristic of warm-blooded animals, rather than the slower, intermittent growth patterns seen in cold-blooded creatures. If this interpretation is correct, then by the late Permian, at least some synapsids had achieved a level of physiological sophistication that rivaled that of modern mammals. They were not cold, sluggish reptiles waiting for the sun to warm them up. They were active, energetic creatures with internal furnaces that kept their bodies warm regardless of the external temperature. They could hunt at night when the air was cool and the reptiles and amphibians were dormant. They could remain active during the winter when cold-blooded competitors were forced into hibernation or torpor. They had, in effect, broken free from the tyranny of the thermometer, and this gave them an enormous competitive advantage. The cynodonts of the late Permian were not the dominant predators of their ecosystems. That role was still held by the gorgonopsians and, to a lesser extent, by the Dinosaurs. The cynodonts were generally smaller and less physically imposing than their gorgonopsian contemporaries, but they were arguably more sophisticated in their anatomy and physiology, and they represented the cutting edge of synapsid evolution. They were the future. They were the lineage that would survive the coming catastrophe and eventually give rise to the mammals. But before we reach that catastrophe, we must turn our attention to another group of organisms that played a crucial role in the Permian ecosystems, the large amphibians. When we think of amphibians today, we think of frogs and salamanders and caecilians, small, secretive creatures that live in damp environments and are vulnerable to habitat loss and pollution. But in the Permian, amphibians were a very different proposition. Some of them were enormous, some of them were terrifying. And some of them were the apex predators of their particular ecological domain, ruling the waterways and lakeshores with an authority that no other animal could challenge. The most impressive of these Permian amphibians were the temnospondyls, a vast and diverse group that had been evolving since the Carboniferous period, and that reached the peak of their diversity and ecological importance during the Permian and Triassic. The temnospondyls included a staggering range of forms, from small, salamander-like creatures to massive, crocodile-like predators that could grow to lengths of several meters. One of the most iconic temnospondyls of the Permian was Eryops, a heavily built predator that lived in the swamps and river margins of the early Permian. Eryops was about 2 meters long, with a broad, flat skull studded with sharp teeth, a powerful, stocky body, and short, robust legs. It was essentially the crocodile of its day, an ambush predator that lurked at the water's edge, waiting for unwary prey to come within striking distance before lunging forward with explosive speed to seize its victim in its wide, tooth-lined jaws. Eryops occupied a crucial ecological niche, bridging the gap between the aquatic and terrestrial worlds. It was equally at home in the water and on land, able to hunt fish and aquatic invertebrates in the streams and ponds, and to ambush terrestrial animals that came to the water to drink. This versatility made it one of the most successful predators in the early Permian ecosystems, and it persisted for millions of years with relatively little change in its basic body plan. Eryops was, by any measure, a triumphantly successful design. But Eryops was not the only large amphibian prowling the Permian waterways. Other temnospondyls, such as the enormous Prionosuchus, which could reach lengths of up to 9 meters, were even more formidable. Prionosuchus was in many ways the ecological equivalent of a modern gharial, with a long, narrow snout filled with needle-like teeth that were ideally suited for catching fish. It lived in the rivers and lakes of equatorial Pangaea, where it was unquestionably the top predator in the aquatic realm. The coexistence of these large amphibians with the synapsid-dominated terrestrial ecosystems created a complex, multi-layered web of predator-prey relationships. The waterways were the domain of the temnospondyls, where their amphibious abilities gave them an unassailable advantage. The land was the domain of the synapsids, where their more advanced locomotion and sensory capabilities made them the superior competitors. And at the interface between these two worlds, along the riverbanks and lakeshores, the boundaries blurred and the two groups competed directly for prey and territory. This interplay between aquatic and terrestrial predators is a pattern that has repeated throughout the history of life. In the modern world, we see it in the relationship between crocodilians and the large mammalian predators that share their habitats. Lions and leopards rule the African savanna, but at the water's edge, the Nile crocodile is king. The same dynamic played out in the Permian, with the synapsids and the temnospondyls each reigning supreme in their respective domains and contesting the border zones where their worlds overlapped. The temnospondyls were also important as prey. While the largest species were too big and powerful for most predators to tackle, the smaller temnospondyls were regular menu items for the larger synapsid carnivores. Dimetrodon, with its powerful jaws and sharp teeth, almost certainly hunted temnospondyls when the opportunity arose, snatching them from the shallows or catching them on land when they ventured too far from the safety of deep water. And the temnospondyls, in turn, preyed on the smaller synapsids that came to the water to drink or to forage along the banks. A young cassade or a small Dinosaur that ventured too close to the water's edge might find itself seized by the jaws of a lurking Eryops and dragged beneath the surface. The Permian world was not a safe place. It was a world of constant danger, where the line between hunter and hunted could shift in an instant, and where every trip to the water hole was a gamble with death. This brings us to a broader point about the nature of Permian ecosystems and the way they functioned. The Permian world was not a simple, straightforward food chain with a single apex predator at the top and a neat hierarchy of consumers below. It was a complex, interconnected web of relationships in which the role of any given species could change depending on the context. A gorgonopsian was an apex predator on land, but in the water it was vulnerable to the same temnospondyls that its cousins preyed upon. A small cynodont was prey for a gorgonopsian, but might itself be a predator of small reptiles and insects. A cassade was a harmless herbivore most of the time, but a large, agitated Cotylophus could probably deliver a devastating blow with its massive tail or trample an unwary predator with its sheer bulk. This ecological complexity is one of the most important aspects of the Permian world because it demonstrates that these ancient ecosystems were every bit as sophisticated and dynamic as the ecosystems we see today. The animals that lived in them were not simple, primitive creatures stumbling through a crude and unrefined world. They were products of hundreds of millions of years of evolution, honed by natural selection to a degree of efficiency and specialization that modern organisms can barely exceed. And yet, for all their sophistication, for all their millions of years of evolutionary refinement, for all their adaptations and specializations and ecological dominance, the rulers of the Permian world were about to face a challenge that none of them, no matter how powerful or well adapted, could survive. Now let us turn our attention to a different group of organisms, one that has been lurking in the background of our story but that deserves its moment in the spotlight. Because the synapsids were not the only game in town. Alongside them, sharing the Permian landscape but occupying secondary and tertiary roles in most ecosystems, were the early sauropsids, the other great branch of the amniote family tree. The sauropsids of the Permian were, for the most part, small and inconspicuous. They were the supporting cast in a drama dominated by the synapsids, the extras in a movie starring the pelycosaurs and therapsids. Most Permian sauropsids were small, lizard-like creatures that scurried through the undergrowth, feeding on insects and other invertebrates and trying to avoid the attention of the much larger synapsid predators that ruled the world above them. But among the sauropsids, something was stirring. A particular subgroup, the archosaurs, was beginning to emerge. The earliest archosaurs of the late Permian were small, lightly built creatures, probably no bigger than a house cat. They had long legs, light bones, and an air of nervous energy about them. They were fast, agile, and alert, qualities that served them well in a world dominated by much larger predators. They were in every sense underdogs, minor players in an ecosystem controlled by the synapsid elite. No one looking at these small, scurrying archosaurs in the late Permian could have predicted what they would become. No one could have foreseen that this unassuming group of small sauropsids would, within a few tens of millions of years, produce the most famous and spectacular group of animals in the history of life on Earth. The dinosaurs, but that story belongs to a later chapter. For now, the archosaurs were bit players, survivors, creatures that lived in the shadows and fed on the scraps left behind by the synapsid lords of the Permian world. Their time would come, but it would come only after a catastrophe of almost unimaginable proportions swept the slate clean and gave them their chance. That catastrophe was the Permian mass extinction. And it is to this event, the single most devastating biological crisis in the history of the planet, that we must now turn our attention. The late Permian world, roughly 252 million years ago, was a world in transition. The great gorgonopsian predators still ruled the land. The large herbivorous therapsids, particularly the cynodonts, a highly successful group of tusked, beaked herbivores, were the dominant plant eaters. The cynodonts were diversifying in the shadows, developing ever more mammal-like features. The temnospondylus still commanded the waterways, and the small archosaurs continued to scurry in the undergrowth, biding their time. On the surface, it might have seemed like this world would continue indefinitely, that the synapsid dynasty would reign forever. But deep beneath the surface of the planet, forces were gathering that would bring this entire world crashing down. In what is now Siberia, a massive plume of magma was rising from the deep mantle, pushing up through the Earth's crust with a force that was almost impossible to comprehend. When it finally broke through, the result was the most intense period of volcanic activity in at least the last 500 million years. This was the Siberian Traps, and the eruption that created them was not a single volcanic event. It was not one volcano erupting spectacularly and then falling silent. It was a sustained, prolonged outpouring of lava that lasted for roughly 2 million years, covering an area of several million square kilometers in layer upon layer of basalt rock, some layers hundreds of meters thick. The total volume of lava erupted was so enormous that it defies easy visualization. Imagine a sea of molten rock covering an area larger than most modern nations, hundreds of meters deep, erupting continuously for hundreds of thousands of years. The sheer scale of this volcanic event was unprecedented, and its consequences for life on Earth were devastating beyond anything that had come before or would come after. The lava itself was destructive enough. Millions of square kilometers of land were buried under basalt, destroying every ecosystem in the affected area and rendering vast tracts of land uninhabitable. but the lava was just the beginning. The real danger came from what the volcanoes released into the atmosphere. The Siberian traps erupted through a region rich in coal deposits, limestone, and other sedimentary rocks containing vast quantities of organic carbon and other volatile compounds. As the magma burned through these deposits, it released enormous quantities of carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, methane, and other gases into the atmosphere. The amounts were staggering. Estimates suggest that the eruptions released enough carbon dioxide to raise the atmospheric concentration of this greenhouse gas by a factor of 10 or more. They released enough sulfur dioxide to generate global acid rain of a severity that would have been lethal to many forms of vegetation. And they may have released enough methane, an even more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, to amplify the warming effect to catastrophic levels. The consequences cascaded through the Earth systems like a series of falling dominoes, each impact triggering the next in a chain reaction of destruction. First came the warming. As carbon dioxide and methane accumulated in the atmosphere, the greenhouse effect intensified dramatically. Global temperatures soared, rising by an estimated 6 to 10 degrees Celsius or more over a period of tens of thousands of years. This might not sound like much, but to put it in perspective, the difference in global average temperature between the modern world and the depths of the last ice age is only about 5 degrees Celsius. A warming of 6 to 10 degrees would have been catastrophic for ecosystems that had evolved under very different conditions. The warming triggered a cascade of secondary effects. The polar ice caps, which had been present in the southern hemisphere during the earlier Permian, melted completely, raising sea levels and flooding vast areas of low-lying coastal land. The ocean circulation patterns, which are driven in part by temperature differences between the equator and the poles, were disrupted, reducing the mixing of surface and deep waters and leading to widespread ocean stagnation. Ocean stagnation, in turn, led to anoxia, a catastrophic depletion of dissolved oxygen in the deep ocean. As the oceans warmed and circulation slowed, the deep waters became stagnant and oxygen-starved. The organisms that lived in these waters, from the tiny plankton that formed the base of the marine food web to the larger creatures that depended on them, began to die off in enormous numbers. Ocean floor became a dead zone, carpeted with the remains of organisms that had suffocated in the oxygen-depleted water. But the horrors did not stop there. As the deep oceans became anoxic, they became a breeding ground for sulfur-reducing bacteria, microorganisms that thrive in oxygen-poor environments and produce hydrogen sulfide as a waste product. Hydrogen sulfide is one of the most toxic gases known. Even in low concentrations, it is lethal to most aerobic organisms. As the anoxic zone expanded and the sulfur-reducing bacteria proliferated, enormous quantities of hydrogen sulfide bubbled up from the deep ocean and were released into the atmosphere. The hydrogen sulfide had two devastating effects. First, it poisoned the surface waters in the atmosphere, killing marine organisms and land animals alike. The stench of rotten eggs, the characteristic smell of hydrogen sulfide, would have pervaded the entire planet. Second, it attacked the ozone layer, the thin shell of ozone in the upper atmosphere that shields the Earth's surface from the sun's ultraviolet radiation. As the ozone layer thinned and fragmented, the amount of harmful UV radiation reaching the surface increased dramatically, causing DNA damage in exposed organisms and further reducing the ability of plants and algae to photosynthesize. And then there was the acid rain. The sulfur dioxide released by the Siberian traps reacted with water vapor in the atmosphere to form sulfuric acid, which fell as rain over vast areas of the globe. This acid rain was devastating to vegetation, killing plants and destroying the soil microorganisms on which plant growth depends. It acidified freshwater lakes and rivers, killing fish and amphibians. It acidified the oceans, dissolving the calcium carbonate shells of marine organisms and destroying the coral reefs and other structures that formed the foundation of marine ecosystems. Each of these individual factors would have been a severe blow to life on Earth. Together, they were annihilating. The Permian mass extinction, often called the Great Dying, was the worst biological catastrophe in the history of our planet. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. Approximately 90 to 96% of all marine species were wiped out. Roughly 70% of all terrestrial vertebrate species disappeared. An estimated 90% or more of all species on Earth across all environments and all taxonomic groups were extinguished. Let those numbers sink in. 9 out of every 10 species on the planet were destroyed. The diversity of life was reduced to a fraction of what it had been. Ecosystems that had taken tens of millions of years to develop were dismantled in a geological instant. Food webs that had been refined by eons of evolution collapsed entirely. The biosphere, the thin layer of life that wraps around our planet, came closer to total annihilation than at any other time in its 4 billion-year history. The synapsid dynasty was shattered. The gorgonopsians, those magnificent saber-toothed predators that had ruled the land for millions of years, were wiped out completely. Not a single species survived. The dinosaurs, already in decline, disappeared entirely. The great herbivorous cynodonts, which had been among the most successful and abundant land animals of the late Permian, were reduced to a handful of surviving lineages. The dinosaurs survived in diminished numbers. The cynodonts, those small, mammal-like creatures that had been evolving in the shadows of the larger therapsids, took a massive hit but managed to hold on. The temnospondyls, those great amphibian predators of the waterways, were devastated but not destroyed. Some lineages survived into the Triassic, where they would continue to play important roles in freshwater ecosystems for millions of years before finally succumbing to competition from more modern groups. And the small archosaurs, those insignificant, scurrying creatures that had lived in the shadows of the synapsid world, they survived. They survived because they were small, because they were adaptable, because they required fewer resources than the larger, more specialized animals that dominated the late Permian ecosystems. In the devastated post-extinction world where resources were scarce and ecosystems were in ruins, being small and unspecialized was an advantage, not a liability. The world that emerged from the Permian mass extinction was a world in ruins. It was a world stripped of most of its biodiversity, a world where the few surviving species wandered through landscapes that had been denuded of vegetation and depopulated of wildlife. The recovery would be long, slow, and painful, taking millions of years before ecosystems returned to anything resembling their former complexity. But recover they did. Life, as it always has, found a way. The period that followed the Permian mass extinction is called the Triassic, and it was a time of extraordinary change and opportunity. With most of the old ecological roles vacated by the extinction, the surviving species had a vast, empty world to fill. And fill it they did, but the new world they created was very different from the one that had been destroyed. The early Triassic was a harsh and unforgiving time. The environmental effects of the Siberian Trap's eruption persisted for millions of years, keeping global temperatures high and oxygen levels low. The oceans remained largely anoxic, and the acid rain continued to fall, albeit with diminishing intensity. Terrestrial ecosystems were sparse and impoverished, dominated by a few hardy, generalist species that could tolerate the extreme conditions. Among the terrestrial vertebrates, the immediate aftermath of the extinction was dominated by a single group, the dicynodonts. One genus in particular, Lystrosaurus, became so widespread and so abundant that it accounted for an estimated 90% of all terrestrial vertebrate individuals in the early Triassic. Lystrosaurus was a medium-sized, pig-like herbivore with a pair of tusks and a horny beak. It was not particularly impressive or specialized, but it was tough, adaptable, and tolerant of a wide range of environmental conditions. In the devastated post-extinction world, these qualities made it the most successful animal on the planet. But the dominance of Lystrosaurus was a temporary phenomenon, a product of the unusual conditions that prevailed in the immediate aftermath of the extinction. As the environment gradually recovered, as temperatures slowly declined and oxygen levels slowly rose, new groups began to emerge and diversify, filling the ecological niches that had been left vacant by the Great Dying. And this is where the story of the archosaurs truly begins. In the early to middle Triassic, the archosaurs began their great diversification. They were still small and insignificant compared to the surviving synapsids, but they were evolving rapidly, developing new body plans and new ecological strategies at a remarkable rate. Some became small, bipedal runners, their hind limbs elongating to allow for fast, efficient locomotion. Others became armored, tank-like herbivores, their bodies encased in bony plates for protection against predators. Still others became semi-aquatic, evolving long snouts and webbed feet for hunting fish in the rivers and lakes. The archosaurs had several advantages over the surviving synapsids in the post-extinction world. Their respiratory system was more efficient, featuring a unidirectional airflow pattern that extracted more oxygen from each breath than the bidirectional system used by synapsids. In a world where atmospheric oxygen levels were low, this was a significant advantage. Their growth rates were faster, allowing them to reach maturity and reproduce more quickly. and their eggs were generally smaller and more numerous, a reproductive strategy that favored rapid population growth in unstable environments. These advantages did not give the archosaurs immediate dominance. The synapsids were still significant components of Triassic ecosystems, and for the first several million years of the Triassic, the two groups coexisted, with neither clearly dominant over the other. But gradually, incrementally, the balance began to shift. The archosaurs diversified more rapidly. They filled more ecological niches. They became, on average, larger and more ecologically dominant. And then, in the middle to late Triassic, something remarkable happened. From among the diverse array of archosaur lineages, a new group emerged. They were small, lightly built bipedal creatures with long tails, grasping hands, and an upright posture that was fundamentally different from the sprawling or semi-sprawling stance of most other animals. They were fast, agile, and based on the evidence of their bone microstructure, warm-blooded. They were the first dinosaurs. The earliest dinosaurs appeared roughly 230 to 233 million years ago, in the late Triassic. They were not the dominant animals of their ecosystems, not yet. In the late Triassic, the world was still ruled by a diverse array of archosaur groups, including the Roysuckians, large, predatory archosaurs that filled the top predator niche, and the Etosaurs, armored herbivores that resembled armadillos the size of pigs. The early dinosaurs were minor players, small, opportunistic creatures that occupied the margins of ecosystems dominated by their larger, more established relatives. But the dinosaurs had something that their competitors did not. They had an upright parasagittal posture that was more efficient for sustained locomotion than the semi-sprawling or columnar postures of other archosaurs. They had a respiratory system that was even more efficient than that of their archosaur relatives, featuring air sacs that extended into their hollow bones and allowed for a continuous flow of fresh air through their lungs. They had fast growth rates that allowed them to reach large body sizes quickly. And they had a metabolic rate that was elevated well above that of most other animals, giving them the stamina and endurance to remain active for extended periods. These advantages were not immediately decisive. In the late Triassic, the dinosaurs coexisted with a diverse array of competitors, and they showed no obvious signs of imminent dominance. But then, at the end of the Triassic, roughly 201 million years ago, another mass extinction struck. This event, the end Triassic extinction, was smaller and less severe than the Great Dying, but it was still devastating, wiping out many of the groups that had dominated Triassic ecosystems. The Roysuckians disappeared, the Etosaurs vanished, many lineages of temnospondyls finally went extinct, and the cynodonts, the last great representatives of the ancient synapsid dynasty, disappeared from the fossil record. In the aftermath of this second extinction, the dinosaurs finally had their chance. With their major competitors eliminated, they diversified explosively, filling every major terrestrial ecological niche within a few million years. They became the dominant herbivores. They became the top predators. They became the most abundant, the most diverse, and the most ecologically important group of land animals on the planet. And they would maintain this dominance for the next 135 million years, ruling the Earth with an authority that no group of animals had ever achieved before or has achieved since. But here is the point that is often missed in the popular telling of this story. The dinosaurs did not earn their dominance through any inherent superiority over the synapsids. They were not better, more advanced, or more deserving than the therapsids they replaced. They were simply the beneficiaries of catastrophe. The Permian mass extinction destroyed the synapsid dynasty that had ruled the Earth for tens of millions of years. The Triassic period that followed was a time of ecological chaos and instability, during which the archosaurs gradually gained an edge over the weakened synapsid survivors. And the end Triassic extinction finished the job, removing the last major competitors and clearing the way for the dinosaurian takeover. If the Permian mass extinction had not occurred, or if it had been less severe, the synapsids might have maintained their dominance indefinitely. The mammals might have evolved much earlier, from the increasingly sophisticated cynodonts and the rosphalians of the late Permian. The dinosaurs might never have risen to prominence at all, remaining small, marginal creatures in a world ruled by our synapsid ancestors. But that is not what happened. History, whether it is the history of civilizations or the history of life, does not follow predetermined paths. It is shaped by contingency, by chance events, by the unpredictable interplay of forces that cannot be foreseen or controlled. The Permian mass extinction was one of those contingent events, a random catastrophe that reshuffled the deck and dealt a new hand to the players in the game of life. And the creatures that drew the winning cards, the archosaurs and their dinosaurian descendants, were not inherently superior to the ones they replaced. They were simply in the right place with the right adaptations at the right time. If the extinction had happened differently, if the environmental conditions of the Triassic had been slightly different, the outcome might have been completely different as well. This is one of the most profound lessons of paleontology. No group holds power forever. Every dynasty, no matter how powerful, no matter how well adapted, no matter how firmly entrenched, is ultimately vulnerable to the forces of change. The synapsids learned this lesson in the Permian. The dinosaurs would learn it 66 million years ago, when an asteroid impact ended their 135 million year reign. And even the mammals, who rose from the ashes of the dinosaurian extinction to claim dominance in the modern world, are not immune to the same forces that brought down their predecessors. The story of the Permian synapsids is a story of extraordinary success and devastating failure, of biological innovation on a grand scale and biological destruction on an even grander one. It is a story that deserves to be told because it is the beginning of our story, the first chapter in the long, improbable narrative that led from the sprawling, sail-backed predators of the Permian to the upright, tool-using primates of the present day. And it is a story that carries within it a warning that is as relevant today as it was 250 million years ago. The systems that sustain life on this planet are complex, interconnected, and ultimately fragile. They can absorb minor shocks and recover from moderate disruptions. But when the disruption is large enough, when the environmental stress exceeds the capacity of ecosystems to absorb and adapt, the consequences can be swift, brutal, and irreversible. The creatures of the Permian did not cause the catastrophe that destroyed them. They were the victims of geological processes over which they had no control. The volcanoes erupted, the atmosphere changed, the climate shifted, and the biosphere collapsed. There was nothing they could do to prevent it or mitigate it. They were swept away by forces that were beyond their comprehension and beyond their control. But their story endures, their legacy endures. In the bones of every mammal on the planet, in the teeth and jaws and ears and fur of every creature that nurses its young and regulates its own body temperature, the inheritance of the Permian synapsids lives on. They are the forgotten rulers of the earth, overshadowed by the dinosaurs that came after them, but no less important, no less remarkable, and no less deserving of our attention and respect. Now, let us delve deeper into the specific anatomical innovations that made the synapsids such successful animals, because understanding these innovations is essential to understanding both the synapsids themselves and the mammals that descended from them. We have already discussed the temporal fenestra, the hole in the skull that defined the synapsid lineage from its earliest days, but the synapsid's cranial architecture evolved far beyond this simple opening. Over the course of the Permian, synapsid skulls underwent a remarkable series of transformations that progressively increased their efficiency as feeding devices. In the earliest synapsids, the jaw joint was formed by the articulation of two small bones at the back of the jaw, the articular bone in the lower jaw and the quadrate bone in the upper jaw. This is the primitive jaw joint, inherited from the earliest tetrapods and still found in modern reptiles and birds. It works adequately, but it has limitations. The muscles that close the jaw attach relatively far from the joint, which reduces the mechanical advantage of the bite. And the joint itself is relatively loose, allowing for limited lateral movement but not for the precise, controlled chewing motions that are necessary for efficient food processing. The therapsids began to change this. As the dentary bone enlarged and the other jaw bones shrank, the jaw muscles shifted their attachment points, moving closer to the bite point and increasing the mechanical advantage of the jaw. This meant that therapsids could generate more force with less muscular effort, allowing them to bite harder and chew more efficiently. The jaw joint itself became more robust and more precisely fitted, allowing for greater control over jaw movements. In the most advanced therapsids, particularly the cynodonts, the lower jaw had become almost entirely composed of the dentary bone, with the other bones reduced to tiny remnants clustered around the jaw joint. The dentary was beginning to develop a new articulation point with the upper jaw, a secondary jaw joint that would eventually replace the old articular quadrate joint entirely. This transition from the old reptilian jaw joint to the new mammalian jaw joint is one of the most thoroughly documented evolutionary transitions in the fossil record, preserved in exquisite detail in hundreds of fossil specimens spanning tens of millions of years. And as we mentioned earlier, the small bones that were displaced from the jaw did not simply disappear. They migrated to the middle ear, where they were repurposed as sound-transmitting ossicles. This is how mammals came to have three middle ear bones, the malleus, incus, and stapes, while reptiles have only one, the stapes. The malleus and incus are the evolutionary descendants of the articular and quadrate bones of the reptilian jaw, transformed over millions of years from feeding structures to hearing structures. This transformation had an enormous impact on mammalian hearing. The three-bone middle ear system is far more sensitive than the single-bone system of reptiles. It can detect a wider range of frequencies, including the high-frequency sounds that are crucial for many mammalian behaviors, such as echolocation in bats and ultrasonic communication in rodents. The superior hearing of mammals is a direct legacy of the jaw evolution that began in the synapsids of the Permian. Another crucial innovation in synapsid evolution was the development of the hard palate, the bony shelf that separates the nasal cavity from the oral cavity. We touched on this earlier when discussing the Rosphalians and cynodonts, but it deserves further attention because of its importance for mammalian physiology. In a skull without a hard palate, the internal nostrils open directly into the front of the mouth. This means that when the animal is eating, food can block the airway, forcing the animal to stop breathing until it has finished chewing and swallowing. This is not a major problem for an animal with a low metabolic rate, one that does not need to breathe continuously to sustain its energy output. But for an animal with a high metabolic rate, one that burns energy rapidly and needs a constant supply of oxygen to fuel its internal furnace, interrupted breathing is a serious handicap. The evolution of the hard palate solved this problem by creating a separate channel for air, running above the palate from the internal nostrils to the back of the throat. With this channel in place, the animal could breathe continuously, even while chewing, maintaining the constant airflow needed to sustain a high metabolic rate. The hard palate was therefore a prerequisite for warm-bloodedness, and its appearance in the fossil record of therapsids is powerful evidence that these animals were indeed developing elevated metabolic rates. The implications of these changes extended far beyond simple anatomy. A higher metabolic rate means more energy available for activity, for growth, for reproduction. It means the ability to maintain a constant body temperature regardless of external conditions, to remain active during the night, during cold weather, during all the times when a cold-blooded animal would be sluggish and vulnerable. It means a fundamentally different way of interacting with the environment, a more dynamic, more energetic, more independent mode of life. The therapsids of the late Permian were not fully warm-blooded in the way that modern mammals are. The transition from ectothermy to endothermy was a gradual process that played out over tens of millions of years, and it is difficult to pinpoint exactly when any particular lineage crossed the threshold from cold-blooded to warm-blooded. But the anatomical evidence strongly suggests that by the late Permian, the most advanced therapsids, particularly the cynodonts, had metabolic rates that were significantly higher than those of their early synapsid ancestors, and probably comparable to those of some modern mammals. This physiological revolution was accompanied by changes in behavior and ecology that are harder to detect in the fossil record, but no less important for understanding the lives of these ancient creatures. An animal with a high metabolic rate needs more food than a comparably sized cold-blooded animal. It needs to eat more frequently and more efficiently. This creates selective pressure for more sophisticated foraging strategies, better sensory capabilities, and more complex behaviors. The cynodonts appear to have risen to this challenge. Their brains, as evidenced by the size and shape of their brain cases, were larger relative to their body size than those of earlier synapsids or contemporary sauropsids. Their snouts bore pits and grooves that suggest the presence of whiskers, which would have provided tactile information about the environment, particularly useful for animals active in low-light conditions. Their teeth were complex and precisely occluding, allowing for efficient processing of food. All of these features point to animals that were more behaviorally sophisticated, more sensorily aware, and more ecologically versatile than their predecessors. Some paleontologists have even suggested that the most advanced Permian cynodonts may have provided parental care to their young, another characteristic that is typically associated with mammals. The evidence for this is circumstantial but intriguing. The relatively small number of offspring produced by advanced therapsids, compared to the much larger clutch sizes of reptiles, suggests that each individual offspring represented a significant investment of parental resources. This investment would be wasted if the young were left to fend for themselves immediately after hatching, as reptile offspring typically are. It makes evolutionary sense that parents who invested heavily in producing a small number of offspring would also invest in protecting and nurturing those offspring after birth, thereby increasing their chances of survival. If this interpretation is correct, then the roots of mammalian parental care, one of the defining characteristics of the mammalian lifestyle, may extend back to the late Permian, to a time when small, furry cynodont parents watched over their young in burrows dug into the Pangean soil. But all of these innovations, all of these remarkable adaptations and behaviors, were put to the ultimate test when the world began to die. The Permian mass extinction did not happen overnight. It was not a single catastrophic event that struck without warning and destroyed everything in an instant. It was a drawn-out, agonizing process that played out over a period of roughly 60,000 to a few 100,000 years, a geological eye blink but an eternity for the individual organisms that had to endure it. The first signs of trouble would have been subtle: a gradual warming of the climate, a slight increase in the frequency of droughts, a slow decline in the productivity of plants as rising carbon dioxide levels and acid rain began to take their toll on vegetation. The animals of the late Permian would not have understood what was happening, could not have comprehended the global forces that were beginning to unravel their world. They would simply have noticed, in whatever way their cognition allowed, that the world was becoming harder, that food was becoming scarcer, that the seasons were becoming more extreme. Then the symptoms would have intensified. The droughts would have become longer and more severe. The vegetation would have thinned noticeably, with forests giving way to scrubland and scrubland giving way to bare soil. Water sources that had been reliable for generations would have dried up or become poisoned by volcanic fallout. The animals would have been forced to range farther and farther in search of food and water, coming into increasingly desperate competition with one another for the dwindling resources. The predators would have been among the first to suffer. As their prey populations declined, the large carnivores would have found it increasingly difficult to sustain themselves, and an Austransevia that needed to eat the equivalent of a large dicynodont every few days would have been in serious trouble when the dicynodont herds began to thin. Some predators would have turned to scavenging, fighting over the carcasses of animals that had died from starvation or dehydration. Others would have turned on each other, cannibalism becoming an increasingly common survival strategy as other food sources disappeared. The herbivores would have suffered in parallel. As the vegetation died back, the herds of dicynodonts and periasaurs that had grazed the Pangean floodplains would have been left without food. They would have migrated, following the retreating greenery toward the coasts and the higher latitudes, where the effects of the warming were slightly less severe. But as the crisis intensified, even these refugia would have failed, and the great herds would have dwindled, their numbers dropping precipitously as starvation, dehydration, and disease took their toll. In the oceans, the situation was even worse. The warming of the surface waters and the disruption of ocean circulation led to widespread anoxia, creating vast dead zones where nothing could survive. The marine food web, which depended ultimately on photosynthetic plankton in the surface waters, collapsed as the plankton died off, poisoned by acid rain, starved of nutrients by the disrupted circulation, and baked by ultraviolet radiation streaming through the damaged ozone layer. Without the plankton, the entire chain of marine consumers, from tiny zooplankton to giant marine reptiles, was left without food. Coral reefs, those bastions of marine biodiversity, were devastated. The acidification of the oceans dissolved the calcium carbonate skeletons of reef-building organisms, and the warming of the waters triggered massive coral bleaching events. Reefs that had taken millions of years to build were destroyed in a matter of centuries, and with them went the myriad of species that depended on them for food and shelter. The freshwater ecosystems fared somewhat better than the marine realm, but they were far from unscathed. Acid rain acidified lakes and rivers, killing fish and amphibians. Warming temperatures reduced the oxygen content of freshwater bodies, stressing the organisms that lived in them. And the loss of terrestrial vegetation led to increased erosion and sedimentation, smothering stream beds and lake bottoms and degrading aquatic habitats. Through all of this, the survivors clung on. Most resilient species, the ones that could tolerate the widest range of conditions, the ones that were smallest and most adaptable, the ones that needed the least food and water to survive, these were the ones that made it through. They huddled in burrows and crevices, emerging only when conditions temporarily improved. They ate whatever they could find: insects, roots, carrion, each other. They bred when they could, producing offspring that were born into a world of diminished resources and constant danger. It was not a heroic survival. It was not a glorious triumph of the fittest. It was a desperate, grinding, miserable endurance test, and the winners were determined not by strength or speed or intelligence, but by sheer tenacity and luck. And when it was over, when the volcanoes finally quieted and the atmosphere began to slowly recover, the survivors emerged into a world that was barely recognizable. The lush, diverse ecosystems of the late Permian were gone, replaced by vast, empty landscapes where the only living things were the small, scattered populations of survivors and the tough, weedy plants that had colonized the denuded soil. This was the beginning of the Triassic. This was the beginning of the long, slow recovery. And this was the beginning of a new chapter in the history of life, a chapter in which the old rulers were gone and new rulers were waiting in the wings. The survivors of the Permian mass extinction faced a world of extraordinary challenges and extraordinary opportunities. The challenges were obvious: a devastated environment, depleted resources, and the absence of the complex ecosystems that had sustained the pre-extinction biota. The opportunities were equally obvious, at least in retrospect. With most of the ecological niches vacated by the extinction, the surviving species had an entire world to fill, and the first groups to do so would have an enormous competitive advantage. In this new world, the old rules no longer applied. The synapsids, which had been the dominant land vertebrates for over 60 million years, were no longer in control. Their numbers had been devastated, their diversity reduced to a shadow of its former glory. The gorgonopsians were gone forever. The dinosaurs were gone. Most of the cynodonts were gone. Only a few lineages of synapsids had survived, some cynodonts, some the dinosaurs, and the small but persistent cynodonts. These survivors would play important roles in the Triassic world, but they would never again achieve the level of dominance that their Permian ancestors had enjoyed. The Triassic belonged to a new group, a group that had been waiting in the shadows for their chance: the archosaurs. And with the archosaurs' rise, we approached the threshold of a new era, an era that would be dominated by the most famous group of animals ever to walk the earth. But the story of how the dinosaurs rose from the ashes of the Permian mass extinction, how they gradually outcompeted and replaced the surviving synapsids, and how they established the most enduring terrestrial dynasty in the history of life, that is a story that requires its own telling in its own time. For now, let us pause and reflect on what we have learned. We have traveled across an abyss of time so vast that the human mind can barely comprehend it. We have walked the floodplains of Pangaea with Dimetrodon and Archaeops. We have watched the gorgonopsians hunt the cynodont herds of the late Permian. We have seen the small, furry cynodonts developing the first glimmerings of warm-bloodedness in their burrows beneath the Pangaean soil. And we have witnessed the beginning of the most devastating catastrophe in the history of life, the Great Dying, the Permian mass extinction that brought the synapsid dynasty to its knees and cleared the way for a new world. The creatures we have met in this journey are not household names. They do not have the cultural cachet of Tyrannosaurus or Triceratops or Brachiosaurus. They do not star in blockbuster movies or adorn lunchboxes, but they are no less remarkable, no less fascinating, and no less important than any dinosaur that ever lived. They were the original rulers of the Earth, the first great dynasty of terrestrial vertebrates, and their story is the foundation on which all subsequent chapters of the story of life are built. They are our ancestors, their bones are our bones, their innovations are our innovations. The teeth we chew with, the ears we hear with, the warm blood that flows through our veins, all of these are legacies of the Permian synapsids, gifts from the forgotten rulers of the Earth, handed down through an unbroken chain of descent spanning 300 million years. And their story is not finished. Because in the aftermath of the Great Dying, as the ruined world slowly healed and new ecosystems tentatively took shape, the descendants of the surviving synapsids would continue their evolutionary journey, continuing to refine and perfect the innovations that their Permian ancestors had begun. They would become smaller, quieter, more secretive, forced into the margins by the rise of the archosaurs and their dinosaurian descendants, but they would survive, they would endure. They would carry the flame of the synapsid lineage through 180 million years of dinosaur domination, waiting once again for their chance. And when that chance came, 66 million years ago, when another catastrophe, this time an asteroid impact, ended the reign of the dinosaurs, the mammals were ready. They emerged from their burrows and their hiding places, and they reclaimed the Earth. They diversified explosively, filling every ecological niche from the deepest oceans to the highest mountains, from the frozen poles to the baking deserts. They produced whales and bats and elephants and horses and primates, and eventually a peculiar, upright walking ape that would develop the capacity to look back across the vast expanse of time and wonder about its own origins. And that ape, that strange, curious, self-aware creature, is you. You are the latest chapter in a story that began in the swamps and floodplains of the Permian, 300 million years ago, with a sprawling, sail-backed predator that basked in the sun and hunted by the river and had no idea, no concept, no inkling that its distant descendants would one day look up at the stars and ask, "Where did we come from?" The answer is here. You came from here, from the forgotten rulers of the earth, from the age before the dinosaurs. And that story continues in our next part, where we will explore in greater depth the aftermath of the Great Dying, the slow and painful recovery of the biosphere, the rise of the archosaurs, and the emergence of the dinosaurs themselves. We will see how the survivors of the Permian mass extinction built a new world from the ruins of the old, and how the descendants of those small, scurrying archosaurs that once lived in the shadow of the synapsid masters became the most dominant group of animals the world has ever seen. The saga of life on Earth is a story of continuous transformation, of dynasties rising and falling, of catastrophes and recoveries, of endings and new beginnings. No group holds power forever. No era lasts indefinitely. The only constant is change itself, the relentless, inexorable, magnificent process of evolution that has been shaping life on this planet for 4 billion years and shows no sign of stopping. The forgotten rulers of the earth understood this, not consciously, not intellectually, but in the only way that matters, through the hard, unforgiving logic of natural selection, through the endless struggle for survival, through the eternal cycle of birth and death and adaptation that is the beating heart of the living world. Their time has passed, but their legacy endures, in you, in every mammal on the planet. In every creature that nurses its young and warms its own blood and listens to the world through ears built from repurposed jawbones. They are not forgotten, not anymore. That is the only way to describe what the Permian mass extinction left behind, where there had once been teeming floodplains crowded with cynodont herds, where great gorgonopsian predators had stalked their prey through lush riverside vegetation, where enormous temnospondyls had lurked in the shallows of ancient rivers. There was now silence. Emptiness, a landscape so thoroughly denuded of life that it would have been almost indistinguishable from the barren, rocky surface of another planet entirely. The rivers still ran, the sun still rose and set, the wind still blew across the face of the supercontinent. But the living world that had existed for tens of millions of years was gone, not diminished, not weakened, gone, and yet in the silence something stirred. In burrows dug into the Pangean soil, small creatures breathed. In the muddy shallows of rivers that had somehow escaped the worst of the chemical poisoning, a few hardy amphibians clung to survival. In the cracks and crevices of bare rock, the first pioneering plants were beginning, tentatively, to reestablish themselves, sending out roots and shoots into the devastated earth, beginning the long, slow process of rebuilding the ecological foundations that all animal life depends upon. Life was not dead. It was wounded almost beyond endurance, reduced to a handful of scattered survivors in a world of ruins, but it was not dead. And from this devastation, over the course of millions of years of slow, painful recovery, a new world would emerge. A world that would be ruled by different creatures, built on different principles, organized around different ecological dynamics. The old order was gone. The new order was only beginning to take shape. And the story of how that new order emerged, of how the ruins of the Permian world were gradually replaced by the vibrant, dinosaur-dominated ecosystems of the Mesozoic, is one of the most remarkable stories in the entire history of life on Earth. This is part 2 of our journey into the deep past. This is the story of recovery, adaptation, and transformation. This is the story of how the world was remade. Let us begin where part 1 left off, in the immediate aftermath of the Great Dying, in the harsh and inhospitable world of the early Triassic. The date is approximately 252 million years ago. The Siberian traps are still erupting, still pumping carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide and other toxic gases into the atmosphere, still driving the climate toward extremes that would be devastating for any modern organism. The global average temperature is roughly 6 to 10 degrees Celsius above what it was in the late Permian, and in the tropics, temperatures may have been so extreme that the equatorial regions of Pangaea were essentially uninhabitable, too hot and too dry for even the most resilient organisms to survive. This pattern, a hot, inhospitable equatorial zone flanked by somewhat more survivable mid-latitude regions, is called the equatorial extinction, and it had profound implications for the distribution of the surviving fauna. The creatures that made it through the Great Dying were concentrated in the higher latitudes, where the temperature extremes were slightly less severe and where moisture was somewhat more available. From these refugia, they would gradually spread back toward the equator as conditions slowly improved, recolonizing the devastated tropical regions over the course of millions of years. The landscape they inhabited in these early post-extinction decades was bleak beyond modern imagination. The vegetation, where it existed at all, was sparse and impoverished. The great seed fern forests of the Permian were gone, replaced by scattered growths of tough, opportunistic plants, particularly lycopsids and simple ferns that could tolerate the harsh conditions. The soil itself was damaged. Millions of years of Permian vegetation had built up a deep, rich layer of organic soil teeming with bacteria, fungi, earthworms, and other decomposers. The extinction had disrupted this below-ground ecosystem as thoroughly as it had disrupted the visible, above-ground world, and rebuilding it would take time. A great deal of time. Without healthy soil, plant growth was limited. Without abundant plant growth, herbivore populations were restricted. Without abundant herbivores, carnivore populations were even more restricted. The entire terrestrial food web was operating at a fraction of its pre-extinction capacity, constrained at every level by the fundamental scarcity of energy and nutrients. This is why the early Triassic is sometimes called the coal gap, a period in the geological record characterized by the near-total absence of the coal deposits that form from the compressed remains of ancient forests. Coals are abundant in the geological record both before and after this interval, but during the early Triassic they are vanishingly rare. This is not a sampling artifact. It is a real signal in the rock record, a geological fingerprint of a world without forests, a world in which the great carbon-capturing, energy-fixing engines of the biosphere had been knocked offline. And yet, in this impoverished world, life persisted. And the creatures that persisted were extraordinary in their resilience and their adaptability. Chief among them, as we noted at the close of Part 1, was Lystrosaurus. This stocky, pig-like cynodont has the distinction of being the most geographically widespread and numerically abundant large-land vertebrate in the entire fossil record. Its bones have been found on every continent, from what is now Antarctica to what is now China, from the southern tip of Africa to the northern edges of the Pangaean landmass. It was everywhere, and in some early Triassic fossil sites, the remains of Lystrosaurus account for the overwhelming majority of all vertebrate fossils found, a dominance of a single species over an ecosystem that has no parallel in the modern world. What made Lystrosaurus so successful in this devastated world? The answer lies in a combination of physiological and behavioral traits that made it uniquely well-suited to the harsh post-extinction environment. Lystrosaurus was small by therapsid standards, roughly the size of a large domestic pig. Small body size means lower absolute food requirements, a crucial advantage in a world where food was scarce. Its beak and tusks were versatile feeding tools, capable of digging up roots and tubers, stripping bark from trees, and processing a wide variety of tough, low-quality plant material. It could eat things that most other herbivores could not, giving it access to food sources that its competitors could not exploit. There is also evidence that Lystrosaurus may have been capable of aestivation, a form of dormancy similar to hibernation, but triggered by heat and drought rather than cold. During the most extreme periods of the early Triassic climate, when temperatures soared and water sources dried up, Lystrosaurus may have retreated underground, entering a state of reduced metabolic activity and simply waiting for conditions to improve. This ability to essentially shut down and wait out bad times would have been an enormous survival advantage in the unpredictable, extreme climate of the early Triassic. Lystrosaurus was also, apparently, highly fecund, capable of reproducing rapidly and producing large numbers of offspring. In a post-extinction world where many ecological niches were vacant and resources were available for any organism that could get there first, rapid reproduction was a decisive advantage. Lystrosaurus populations could bounce back from local disasters quickly, recolonizing areas that had been temporarily depopulated and maintaining their overwhelming numerical dominance. But for all its success, Lystrosaurus was not the only survivor of the Great Dying. Alongside it, sharing the impoverished early Triassic landscape, were other therapsid lineages that had somehow made it through. The Therosphalians, those medium-sized predatory and omnivorous therapsids that had occupied important ecological roles in the late Permian, were still present, though in reduced diversity and numbers. And the cynodonts, those small, mammal-like creatures whose anatomical innovations had been pointing toward mammalian-grade physiology, were not only still present but beginning to diversify in new and interesting directions. The early Triassic cynodonts were a pivotal group. They were the direct ancestors of the mammals, the lineage from which all subsequent mammalian diversity would eventually flow. And the conditions of the early Triassic, harsh and demanding as they were, may actually have accelerated the evolution of mammalian characteristics in some cynodont lineages. Consider the logic. In the devastated post-extinction world, the ability to regulate one's own body temperature, to remain active in cold weather and during the night, to maintain a consistent activity level regardless of external temperature fluctuations. These abilities would have been enormously valuable. A warm-blooded cynodont could forage for the scarce food resources of the early Triassic at times when cold-blooded competitors were forced into inactivity by cool temperatures. It could exploit food sources that were inaccessible to ectotherms, including insects and other invertebrates that were most active during the cooler hours of dawn and dusk. It could maintain the sustained activity levels necessary to travel the long distances required to find adequate food in a sparsely vegetated landscape. In short, the selective pressures of the early Triassic may have pushed cynodont evolution in the direction of full endothermy, full warm-bloodedness, more strongly and more rapidly than any pressures that had existed in the relatively benign late Permian. The catastrophe that nearly destroyed the synapsid lineage may have, paradoxically, also provided the conditions that drove the final stages of the transition from therapsid to mammal. This is a phenomenon that paleontologists call catastrophe-driven evolution, and it is a recurring theme in the history of life. Mass extinctions do not just destroy, they also create. By clearing the ecological stage and changing the selective environment, they can open pathways for rapid evolutionary change that would not have been possible in the more stable, competitive ecosystems of the pre-extinction world. The survivors of the Great Dying were not just the remnants of a destroyed world. They were also the raw material for a new one. Now, alongside the struggling synapsids of the early Triassic, another group of animals was also beginning to make its mark. The archosaurs, those small, agile sauropsids that had lived in the shadows of the Permian synapsid world, were diversifying rapidly, taking advantage of the ecological opportunities created by the extinction to explore new body plans and new ecological strategies. The archosaurs of the early Triassic were remarkably diverse despite their small size. Some were small, lightly built runners that fed on insects and other invertebrates. Others were semi-aquatic, spending much of their time in rivers and lakes where they hunted fish. Still others were developing the first hints of the armoring, the bony plates and scutes embedded in the skin that would become a distinctive feature of several major archosaur lineages. And a few were beginning to experiment with a more upright posture, positioning their hind limbs more directly beneath their bodies for more efficient bipedal or semi-bipedal locomotion. This diversity of archosaur body plans reflects the diversity of ecological opportunities available in the early Triassic world. With so many niches vacant and so little competition from the surviving synapsids, the archosaurs were free to explore evolutionary space in ways that would not have been possible in the more crowded, more competitive world of the Permian. Natural selection, operating on the abundant genetic variation present in archosaur populations, drove rapid diversification, with new lineages emerging and diverging at a rate that, by geological standards, was almost breathtaking. It is important, though, to put this archosaur radiation in perspective. In the early Triassic, the archosaurs were not yet dominant. The synapsids, particularly the dicynodonts and cynodonts, were still numerically and ecologically important. The temnospondyl amphibians, while reduced in diversity from their Permian peak, were still abundant in freshwater environments. And a variety of other groups, including early relatives of the lizards and other non-archosaur sauropsids, were also present. The early Triassic world was a complex, multi-layered ecological community, not the simple archosaur-dominated world that it would eventually become. The transition from synapsid dominance to archosaur dominance was not a single event. It was a gradual process that played out over millions of years of the Triassic, driven by a complex interplay of ecological, physiological, and evolutionary factors. And it was not inevitable. At several points in the early and middle Triassic, the synapsid lineages seemed poised for a comeback, their diversity and ecological importance recovering to levels that might have challenged the archosaur radiation. But each time, some combination of climatic stress, ecological competition, and evolutionary constraint pushed the balance back toward the archosaurs. Let us trace this trajectory more carefully, because understanding how the archosaurs replaced the synapsids as the dominant land vertebrates is essential to understanding the world that followed. In the early Triassic, roughly 252 to 247 million years ago, the world was still reeling from the extinction. Both synapsids and archosaurs were present, but neither group was particularly diverse or ecologically dominant. The world was essentially ecological empty space waiting to be filled. The first filling happened quickly in geological terms. Within a few million years of the extinction, the surviving synapsids had begun to diversify, producing new species and new ecological variants at a pace commensurate with the opportunities available. The dicynodonts, despite being severely reduced, managed to persist and even expand somewhat, with new species filling herbivore roles in the recovering ecosystems. The cynodonts diversified into a range of small to medium-sized predator and omnivore niches. And in the freshwater ecosystems, the surviving temnospondyls flourished, their amphibian lifestyle making them well-suited to the waterway environments that had been less thoroughly disrupted by the extinction than the terrestrial realm. But the archosaurs were diversifying even more rapidly, and critically, they were developing new physiological and anatomical capabilities that gave them advantages over the synapsids in key ecological arenas. One of the most important of these advantages was related to locomotion. Early Triassic archosaurs were developing a more upright hindlimb posture than any synapsid of the time had achieved. While the most advanced cynodonts had somewhat more erect hindlimbs than their Permian ancestors, they still had a semi-sprawling gait that was less efficient than the fully upright parasagittal locomotion that the early archosaurs were evolving. An upright posture allows for longer strides, better balance, and crucially the ability to breathe efficiently during locomotion, something that sprawling animals struggle with because the sideways bending of the body during a sprawling gait compresses the lungs alternately on each side, interfering with breathing. An archosaur with upright hindlimbs could run and breathe simultaneously without difficulty, allowing it to sustain aerobic activity for longer periods than a similarly sized sprawling animal. In an ecosystem where pursuit, predation, and prolonged foraging were becoming important survival strategies, this respiratory advantage was significant. The archosaurs also had an advantage in terms of their egg-laying biology. While both archosaurs and synapsids laid amniotic eggs, archosaur eggs tended to be smaller and more numerous than those of comparable synapsids. A strategy of producing many small eggs, each representing a relatively modest investment of parental resources, is more resilient than a strategy of producing few large eggs in the face of environmental unpredictability. If a clutch of eggs is destroyed by a predator or a flash flood, a small egg layer can recover quickly by producing another clutch, while a large egg layer, which may have invested enormous resources in a single clutch, cannot recover as readily. In the unstable, unpredictable environments of the early and middle Triassic, this difference in reproductive strategy may have given the archosaurs a significant resilience advantage over the synapsids, allowing them to maintain and rebuild their populations more effectively in the face of the recurring environmental stresses that characterized this period. These advantages in locomotion, in respiration, and in reproduction were not decisive in themselves. No single adaptation ever is. Evolution does not produce silver bullets that solve all problems at once. Instead, it produces incremental improvements that shift the competitive balance slightly in favor of one group over another, and these small shifts accumulate over time to produce large-scale patterns of dominance and replacement. The shift from synapsid dominance to archosaur dominance in the Triassic was exactly this kind of gradual, incremental process. It happened at different rates in different environments and in different parts of the world. It involved not just the competitive replacement of synapsids by archosaurs, but also the extinction of synapsid lineages through a series of smaller environmental perturbations that struck the Triassic world at irregular intervals, each one reducing synapsid diversity and giving the archosaurs another opportunity to expand. The Middle Triassic, roughly 247 to 235 million years ago, was a period of significant ecological reorganization. The world was still warm and largely arid, with the vast interior of Pangaea remaining a desert or semi-desert. But the coastal and mid-latitude regions were becoming more productive, with recovering vegetation supporting increasingly diverse animal communities. And in these communities, the archosaurs were beginning to assert their dominance. Two major archosaur lineages were emerging during this period, and they would eventually give rise to the two most important groups of land vertebrates in the history of life. One lineage, the pseudosuchians or false crocodiles, would eventually produce the crocodilians and a diverse array of extinct relatives. The other lineage, the avametidarsalians or bird-line archosaurs, would eventually produce the dinosaurs and from them the birds. In the Middle Triassic, neither of these lineages was yet dominant. The pseudosuchians included a range of medium to large-sized predators and herbivores that were important components of mid-Triassic ecosystems, but they were not yet the apex predators of their world. That role was still largely filled by larger, more derived archosaurs and by some of the surviving synapsid carnivores. and the avametidarsalians were just beginning to diversify, with several lineages of small to medium-sized forms exploring different ecological strategies. Among the early avametidarsalians, one group deserves special attention: the pterosaurs. These extraordinary creatures, the first vertebrates to achieve powered flight, appeared in the fossil record in the late Triassic with a suddenness that has long puzzled paleontologists. Unlike the dinosaurs, whose evolutionary precursors can be traced through a series of progressively more bird-like archosaurs in the Middle and Late Triassic, the pterosaurs appear in the fossil record already fully formed as flying animals, with no clear transitional forms linking them to their presumed non-flying ancestors. This is one of the most tantalizing mysteries in paleontology. The evolution of pterosaur flight represents a quantum leap in biological capability, a transition from a ground-dwelling or tree-dwelling ancestor to a fully volant organism capable of sustained, powered flight. How did it happen? When did it happen? What were the intermediate stages? These questions remain unresolved, and the origin of the pterosaurs is one of the most actively debated topics in vertebrate paleontology. What we do know is that the pterosaurs were extraordinary creatures. Even the earliest known pterosaurs were fully capable of powered flight, with wings formed by a membrane of skin stretching from the elongated fourth finger of the hand to the side of the body and the leg. They had hollow, lightweight bones, a keeled sternum for anchoring powerful flight muscles, and evidence suggests a covering of hair-like filaments called pycnofibers that provided insulation and indicated a warm-blooded metabolism. The pterosaurs diversified rapidly following their appearance, filling aerial ecological niches that had never before been exploited by vertebrates. They ranged from small, insect-catching forms to large fish hunters with wingspans of several meters. They colonized coastal environments, freshwater habitats, and open terrestrial landscapes. They were, in every ecological sense, the birds of the Triassic and Jurassic worlds, filling the air with life and sound and movement in a way that the Earth had never seen before. But the pterosaurs, spectacular as they were, are not the central players in the story we are telling. They are a fascinating sideshow, an astonishing example of evolutionary innovation, but the main drama of the Triassic was playing out on the ground, where the fate of the synapsids and the archosaurs was being decided. And it is to that drama that we must return, because in the late Triassic, the pace of events began to accelerate, and the stage was being set for one of the most decisive transitions in the history of terrestrial life. By the late Triassic, roughly 235 to 201 million years ago, the world had changed dramatically from the devastated landscape of the early post-extinction period. The ecosystems had recovered significantly, though they were still far less diverse than the Permian world they had replaced. Vegetation was more abundant and more varied, with the first conifer forests appearing in many regions and creating new habitats and food resources for the animals that inhabited them. The atmospheric oxygen levels were recovering. Temperatures, while still warm, were somewhat lower than the extreme highs of the early Triassic. The world was becoming once again a place where complex, multi-layered ecosystems could develop, and develop they did. The late Triassic world was a time of remarkable ecological diversity and dynamism, with a cast of animals that would have astonished any modern observer. The pseudosuchian archosaurs had diversified into a spectacular array of forms. The etosaurs, heavily armored herbivores with bodies encased in bony plates and small, shovel-like snouts for rooting in the soil, were important components of terrestrial ecosystems. The rauisuchians, large, powerful predators with massive skulls and serrated teeth, occupied the apex predator niche in many late Triassic ecosystems, filling the role that the gorgonopsians had played in the Permian. The dicynodonts, those resilient therapsid survivors, had staged a remarkable comeback. Several new lineages had evolved, including some very large forms, and the dicynodonts were once again significant components of terrestrial herbivore communities. In some late Triassic ecosystems, large dicynodonts such as the enormous placerias, which could reach lengths of 3 meters and weights of several hundred kilograms, were the dominant large herbivores, playing a role comparable to that of the large herbivorous mammals in modern ecosystems. And the cynodonts were still present, still evolving, still refining the mammalian body plan that they had been developing since the Permian. By the late Triassic, the cynodont lineage had diverged into several distinct groups. Some had become larger and more specialized as herbivores or omnivores. Others had remained small and carnivorous. And one particular lineage, the most derived cynodonts, had reached a level of anatomical sophistication that placed them at the very threshold of true mammalhood. These most advanced cynodonts, known collectively as the probonignathians, possessed essentially all of the diagnostic features of mammals, including a highly derived lower jaw dominated almost entirely by the dentary bone, complex multi-cusped molars for precise food processing, evidence of a secondary palate, and bone growth patterns consistent with endothermy. The only features they lacked, as far as we can tell from fossils, were the full mammalian middle ear arrangement and perhaps true viviparity, the live birth of young that characterizes most modern mammals. From among the probenignathans in the late Triassic, somewhere between 225 and 210 million years ago, emerged the first true mammals. These were tiny creatures, mostly shrew-sized or smaller, with bodies so small that they would easily fit in the palm of a human hand. They were almost certainly nocturnal, their large eyes adapted for seeing in low light, their sensitive whiskers helping them navigate in the darkness, their warm-blooded metabolism allowing them to remain active through the cool nights when the cold-blooded reptiles and archosaurs were sluggish. The first mammals were not impressive by any external measure. They were not large. They were not powerful. They were not, in any obvious way, special. In the late Triassic world, dominated by large archosaurs and late surviving dicynodonts, the first mammals were insignificant, marginal creatures, so small and so inconspicuous that they have left an almost vanishingly sparse fossil record. Finding a Triassic mammal fossil is an event of major scientific significance, an occasion for celebration in paleontological circles, because these creatures were so small and their bones so delicate that they almost never fossilized. But they were there, and they were the future. The appearance of the first mammals marks the culmination of the extraordinary evolutionary journey that we have been tracing through this documentary. From the first simple amniotes of the Carboniferous, through the pelycosaurs and the therapsids, through the dinosaurs and the gorgonopsians and the cynodonts, the synapsid lineage had been moving over hundreds of millions of years toward a body plan of increasing sophistication and complexity. And now, in the late Triassic, that journey had reached its first major destination, the mammal. It is a destination that deserves to be appreciated in its full context. The mammals of the late Triassic were not the end point of evolution. They were a beginning, the starting point of a new and even more extraordinary chapter of the synapsid story. But they were also a culmination, the product of 300 million years of evolutionary innovation, carrying within their small, warm, furry bodies the accumulated biological legacy of every synapsid that had come before them. Now, while all of this was happening in the world of the synapsids, another story was unfolding in the world of the Avametidarsalian archosaurs, because it was in the late Triassic that the dinosaurs truly appeared. We have already touched on the earliest dinosaurs, those small, bipedal creatures that appeared roughly 230 to 233 million years ago. But let us now examine their rise in greater detail, because understanding how the dinosaurs went from insignificant minor players in a diverse late Triassic ecosystem to the dominant land animals on the planet is one of the great puzzles of paleontology. The earliest dinosaurs belonged to two major lineages, the saurischians, or lizard-hipped dinosaurs, which would eventually give rise to the sauropods and the theropods, and the ornithischians, or bird-hipped dinosaurs, which would eventually give rise to the armored, horned, and duck-billed dinosaurs of the Cretaceous. These two lineages diverged very early in dinosaur history, probably within a few million years of the group's origin, and they would go on to produce radically different body plans and ecological strategies over the course of the next 165 million years. But in the late Triassic, neither lineage had yet realized its potential. The earliest saurischians were mostly small, bipedal carnivores and omnivores, lightly built animals with long legs, grasping hands, and agile predatory habits. The earliest ornithischians were small herbivores, similarly lightly built, that fed on low-growing vegetation. Neither group was particularly large, neither was particularly numerous, and neither was ecologically dominant. The dinosaurs shared their late Triassic world with a diverse community of other archosaurs, and for much of the late Triassic, they were not obviously on their way to dominance. The Roysuchians were larger and more powerful predators than the early theropod dinosaurs. The etosaurs were more abundant and more widely distributed than the early ornithischian dinosaurs. The rhynchosaurs, a group of non-archosaur reptiles with parrot-like beaks, were among the most numerous herbivores in many late Triassic ecosystems. So what changed? What allowed the dinosaurs to go from minor players to dominant rulers? The answer, as we have already hinted, involves catastrophe. Specifically, it involves the end Triassic mass extinction, the second great extinction event of the Mesozoic, which struck approximately 201 million years ago and reshuffled the ecological deck once again. The end Triassic extinction was caused, like the Permian extinction before it, by a massive episode of volcanic activity, this time associated with the breakup of Pangaea. As the supercontinent began to rift apart, enormous quantities of lava poured out along the rift zones, particularly in the region that would eventually become the Central Atlantic. These eruptions, known as the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province or CAMP, released massive quantities of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, triggering a greenhouse warming event that disrupted global climate and acidified the oceans. The end Triassic extinction was not as severe as the Permian extinction. It did not kill 90% of all species, but it was still devastating, eliminating many of the major players in late Triassic ecosystems and fundamentally reorganizing the terrestrial communities that survived. The Roysuckians, those large, powerful pseudosuchian predators that had occupied the top predator niche in many late Triassic ecosystems, were wiped out entirely. The Etosaurs disappeared. The Rhynchosaurs vanished. Many lineages of temnospondyls, already much reduced from their Permian peak, finally went extinct. And critically, the large dicynodonts, the last truly prominent therapsid herbivores, disappeared from the fossil record. With these competitors and ecological incumbents removed, the dinosaurs were finally free to expand. And expand they did with explosive rapidity. Within a few million years of the end Triassic extinction, dinosaurs had become the dominant land vertebrates on Earth, filling herbivore and carnivore niches across the entire extent of the now fragmenting Pangaean landmass. The early Jurassic world, which followed immediately after the end Triassic extinction, was a world transformed. The ecological landscape had been reorganized almost as thoroughly as it had been after the Permian extinction, and the dinosaurs were the primary beneficiaries of this reorganization. The sauropodomorph dinosaurs, which would eventually give rise to the giants of the Jurassic and Cretaceous, began their rapid size increase, growing from relatively modest beginnings in the late Triassic to the truly colossal proportions that would make them the largest land animals in the history of the planet. The theropod dinosaurs, the predatory lineage that would eventually give rise to birds, diversified into a range of sizes from small, agile hunters to large, powerful apex predators that replaced the Roysuckians at the top of the food chain. And in the shadows of these giant dinosaurs, tiny and inconspicuous, the mammals endured. They did not disappear in the end Triassic extinction. They survived as they had survived the Permian extinction 60 million years before. But they did not thrive, not in any obvious, outwardly impressive way. Through the entire 165 million years of the Mesozoic era, the age of the dinosaurs, the mammals remained small, secretive, and ecologically marginal. Most were no larger than a mouse. Most were probably nocturnal. Most fed on insects, worms, and other small invertebrates. And yet, during this long period of apparent obscurity, the mammals were not standing still. They were evolving. They were diversifying, exploring new ecological niches, developing new physiological capabilities, refining the biological toolkit that the synapsids of the Permian had begun to assemble. Some Mesozoic mammals became semi-aquatic, adapting to life in streams and lakes. Others became gliders, developing skin membranes for leaping from tree to tree. Still others became diggers, burrowing into the earth for food and shelter. The Mesozoic mammals were a remarkably diverse group, far more so than the popular image of a single, undifferentiated proto-mammal lineage would suggest. They were experimenting with body plans and ecological strategies, testing the boundaries of what the mammalian body could do, setting the stage for the explosive radiation that would follow the extinction of the dinosaurs. But we are getting ahead of ourselves once again. Let us return to the main thread of our story and examine, in more depth, the ecological dynamics of the world that the synapsids built and lost, and the world that emerged in their absence. One of the most fascinating aspects of the transition from the synapsid-dominated Permian to the archosaur-dominated Mesozoic is the way in which ecological roles were transferred from one group to another. In ecology, this phenomenon is known as ecological equivalence or convergent ecology, and it is one of the most striking patterns in the history of life. The Permian synapsids had established a template for how complex terrestrial ecosystems should be organized. There were large apex predators. There were medium-sized secondary predators. There were large herbivores. There were medium-sized herbivores. There were small omnivores and insectivores. There were scavengers and opportunists. This organizational template, this general structure of the food web, is not unique to the Permian. It is a recurring pattern that appears whenever complex terrestrial ecosystems develop, because it reflects the fundamental way in which energy flows through biological communities. When the Permian extinction destroyed the synapsid-dominated world, it did not destroy this organizational template. The template persisted, encoded in the ecological logic of the biosphere itself. And when the new post-extinction world began to recover, the same basic organizational structure re-emerged, but populated by different creatures. The large apex predators of the Permian, the gorgonopsians, were replaced by the large predatory archosaurs of the Triassic, which were in turn replaced by the large theropod dinosaurs of the Jurassic and Cretaceous. The large herbivores of the Permian, the dicynodonts and periasaurs, were replaced by the large herbivorous dinosaurs, the prosauropods and sauropods and ornithopods. The medium-sized predators and omnivores of the Permian, the therosphalians and small cynodonts, were replaced by smaller archosaurs and eventually by the mammals themselves. This ecological equivalence is more than just a superficial resemblance. It reflects deep biological principles about the way energy flows through ecosystems, the constraints imposed by the laws of thermodynamics on the structure of food webs, and the way natural selection converges on similar solutions to similar ecological problems, even when working with completely different raw materials. When we see a sauropod dinosaur eating vegetation and a gorgonopsian hunting dicynodonts, we are not just seeing two different animals from two different times. We are seeing the same ecological roles, filled by different creatures, playing out the same fundamental dynamics of predator and prey, herbivore and plant that have governed terrestrial ecosystems since the first complex food webs developed on land. The names change, the faces change, but the ecological play remains essentially the same. This continuity, this persistence of ecological structure across the most catastrophic biological events in the history of the planet is one of the most profound lessons of paleontology. Life is remarkably resilient, not every species, not every lineage, not every innovation. But the basic organizational principles of complex ecosystems, the general structure of food webs, the division of ecological roles, these have proven remarkably resistant to disruption, even by events as catastrophic as the Permian mass extinction. After 5 to 10 million years of recovery following the Great Dying, the basic template of a complex terrestrial ecosystem was re-established, populated by different creatures, but organized along the same fundamental principles. After another 5 to 10 million years, the new world was beginning to approach the ecological complexity of the old one. And after 20 to 30 million years, the Triassic world was, in terms of ecological diversity and complexity, broadly comparable to the Permian world it had replaced, despite being inhabited by an almost entirely different cast of characters. This is the remarkable resilience of the biosphere, the capacity of the living world to rebuild itself after catastrophe. It is not quick by human standards. Millions of years of recovery are not meaningful on any timescale that humans can directly experience. But on the geological timescale, the recovery from even the most devastating mass extinction is relatively swift. Life always comes back. It has come back every time it has been knocked down, and the new worlds that have emerged after each catastrophe have been, in their own ways, just as rich and complex and beautiful as the worlds they replaced. Now let us turn our attention to one of the most important but least appreciated aspects of the synapsid story, the role of the surviving therapsid lineages in shaping the post-extinction world of the Triassic. When we talk about the transition from synapsid dominance to archosaur dominance, it is tempting to frame it as a simple replacement, the archosaurs replacing the synapsids in all ecological roles simultaneously. But the reality was far more complicated and far more interesting than this simplified narrative suggests. In many ecosystems and during much of the Triassic, synapsids and archosaurs coexisted, competing for resources, partitioning the available ecological niches, and shaping each other's evolution through their interactions. The dicynodonts, as we have noted, staged a remarkable comeback in the Middle and Late Triassic. After being devastated by the Great Dying, the surviving dicynodont lineages diversified rapidly, producing a range of new species that filled herbivore roles across the recovering Triassic world. The canomeriid dicynodonts of the Middle Triassic were large, robust herbivores that rivaled the dinosaurs in size and ecological importance. Stalochiria, a large canomeriid from what is now Brazil, could reach lengths of up to 3 meters and was one of the most important large herbivores in its ecosystem. Ischigualastia, another large dicynodont from the same region, lived alongside some of the very earliest dinosaurs and clearly competed with them for plant resources. The coexistence of large dicynodonts and early dinosaurs in the late Triassic is particularly instructive. It demonstrates that the dinosaurs did not immediately or automatically displace the synapsids when they appeared. For millions of years, the two groups coexisted as major herbivores in the same ecosystems, and it was only the end Triassic extinction that finally tipped the balance decisively in favor of the dinosaurs. The cynodont lineages, too, remained important components of Triassic ecosystems long after the extinction. The traversodontid cynodonts, a group of medium-sized herbivores with complex, leaf-shaped molars for processing plant material, were abundant and widespread in the Middle Triassic. They occupied herbivore niches that were not yet dominated by dinosaurs, filling a mesoherbivore role comparable to that of modern antelope or deer. The small carnivorous cynodonts, meanwhile, continued to occupy predatory and omnivore niches, hunting insects, small vertebrates, and eggs in the undergrowth of Triassic ecosystems. These surviving synapsids were not relics, not evolutionary dead ends clinging to existence in a world that had passed them by. They were active, successful, ecologically important animals that were still evolving, still adapting, still contributing to the complexity of the ecosystems they inhabited. They were, in a very real sense, fighting for their place in a world that was increasingly being reshaped by the Archosaur radiation, and they were losing that fight. Not immediately, not completely, not without a struggle, but over the course of the Triassic the trend was clear. The Archosaurs were diversifying faster, occupying more ecological niches, achieving larger body sizes, and becoming more numerically dominant in the terrestrial ecosystems of Pangaea. By the end of the Triassic, the large synapsid herbivores and carnivores had been largely displaced, surviving only in reduced numbers and in restricted ecological roles. The cynodonts, however, persisted, and from among the cynodonts the first true mammals had emerged. These tiny, nocturnal, insectivorous creatures were the ultimate survivors of the synapsid lineage, the last remaining representatives of a dynasty that had once ruled the world. They lived in the interstices of the dinosaurian world, exploiting the ecological spaces too small for the dinosaurs to fill, surviving on the food sources too scarce or too difficult to access for larger animals. They survived in this marginal existence for 165 million years. And when the opportunity finally came, when the asteroid struck 66 million years ago and ended the dinosaurian reign, they were ready. They had spent 165 million years in the training ground of adversity, being shaped by natural selection into the most adaptable, the most versatile, the most cognitively sophisticated animals on Earth. The mammalian radiation of the Cenozoic, the last 66 million years of Earth history, is in many ways the completion of a story that began in the Permian, 300 million years ago. The warm-bloodedness, the complex teeth, the enlarged brains, the parental care, the social behavior, all of these characteristics that define the mammals and make them such successful and diverse animals have their roots in the synapsid lineage of the Permian and its subsequent evolution through the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous. The mammals are not a new kind of creature that appeared from nowhere 66 million years ago. They are the latest chapter in the ancient synapsid story, the living descendants of the forgotten rulers of the Permian world. And every characteristic that makes them, that makes us, what we are today is the product of hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary refinement, stretching back through time to a sail-backed predator basking in the sun on the floodplains of Pangaea. Now let us explore some of the specific Triassic synapsid lineages in greater depth, because these creatures, living in the shadow of the rising Archosaur radiation, are every bit as fascinating and important as their more famous Permian ancestors. Among the most remarkable of the Triassic synapsids were the ictitosaurs, a group of extremely derived cynodonts that approached the mammalian grade of organization so closely that their exact taxonomic placement has been debated for decades. The ictitosaurs, including forms such as Diathrognathus and Pachygenellus, had two simultaneous jaw joints operating at the same time: the old, primitive articular quadrate joint and the new, derived dentary squamosal joint that would eventually characterize all true mammals. This double joint arrangement is one of the most remarkable intermediate stages in the history of vertebrate evolution, a fossil snapshot of the precise moment of transition between two fundamentally different skeletal configurations. The existence of Diathrognathus and similar forms is a testament to the power of the fossil record to capture evolutionary transitions in action. These animals were, quite literally, between two states. Their skulls contained both the old jaw joint and the new one, operating simultaneously, the perfect illustration of the gradual, mosaic nature of evolutionary change. They did not suddenly transform from one body plan to another. Instead, the transition happened incrementally, bone by bone, joint by joint, over millions of years of natural selection. Another important late Triassic cynodont group was the Tritylodontids, large, rodent-like herbivores that were among the most derived of all non-mammalian cynodonts. Tritylodontids had complex, multi-cusped molars with rows of cusps that interlocked precisely when the jaws closed, allowing for sophisticated processing of tough plant material. They were in many ways the ecological equivalents of modern rodents, medium-sized herbivores that fed on seeds, tough vegetation, and roots. Like the modern rodents they convergently resembled, they were remarkably successful, persisting through the end Triassic extinction and surviving well into the Jurassic period. The Tritylodontids' persistence into the Jurassic is significant because it demonstrates that the therapsid lineage did not simply vanish at the end of the Triassic, replaced overnight by the dinosaurs. The transition was gradual, and some synapsid lineages remained ecologically important well into the Dinosaurian era. The Tritylodontids coexisted with large sauropods and predatory theropods, filling the small to medium herbivore niche in Jurassic ecosystems. They did not disappear until the early Cretaceous, roughly 120 million years ago, by which time the mammals themselves had diversified sufficiently to fill the ecological roles that the Tritylodontids had occupied. This long overlap between therapsids and dinosaurs is rarely appreciated in popular accounts of the Dinosaurian era. The conventional narrative presents the dinosaurs as suddenly replacing the synapsids, sweeping away the old order and establishing a new, exclusively dinosaurian world, but the reality was far more nuanced. For tens of millions of years of the Mesozoic, therapsid survivors and dinosaurs shared the same ecosystems, interacted with each other, competed for resources, and influenced each other's evolution. The world of the Mesozoic was not a purely dinosaurian world. It was a world in transition, still carrying the ecological legacy of the Permian synapsid dynasty even as the new dinosaurian order was establishing itself. Let us now consider the environment and ecology of the recovering Triassic world in more depth, because the physical setting of the Triassic is as important as the biological actors that inhabited it. The Triassic world was a world in the early stages of continental drift. Pangaea, the great supercontinent that had defined the geographical reality of the Permian world, was beginning to rift apart. The stresses that would eventually split Pangaea into separate continents were already manifesting as rift valleys, fault systems, and volcanic activity along what would one day become the Atlantic Ocean. The world was not yet divided into the familiar continents of the modern world, but the first cracks in the supercontinent were appearing. This incipient fragmentation had important implications for the distribution of life. As rift valleys formed and shallow seas began to flood the low-lying areas between the rifting land masses, barriers to animal dispersal began to appear. Species that had once roamed freely across the entire extent of Pangaea began to be separated from each other by geographic barriers, triggering the kind of isolation and divergence that drives speciation. The relatively uniform fauna of the early Triassic began to differentiate, with different lineages evolving independently in the different regions of the fragmenting supercontinent. This geographic differentiation is visible in the fossil record of the late Triassic. While some groups, particularly the dinosaurs, were still cosmopolitan, found across the entire extent of the supercontinent, others were becoming increasingly restricted to particular regions. The faunal assemblages of the late Triassic show increasing geographic diversity, with distinctly different communities of animals in what would one day become North and South America, Europe, Africa, Asia, and Antarctica. The climate of the Triassic was also undergoing significant changes. The extreme heat and aridity of the early Triassic, driven by the volcanic warming of the Great Dying, was gradually giving way to a somewhat more moderate, though still generally warm, global climate. Rainfall became more seasonal and more predictable, with distinct wet and dry seasons established in many parts of the world. This seasonality drove the diversification of plant communities, with different plant species adapted to the wet season and the dry season, creating a more complex and productive vegetative environment for the animals that depended on plants for food. The recovery of plant diversity during the Triassic was one of the most important developments of the period, because it was the foundation on which the recovering animal ecosystems were built. As plant communities became more diverse and more productive, the herbivore communities that fed on them became more diverse and more productive as well. And as the herbivore communities grew in diversity and abundance, the predator communities that depended on them followed suit. The ecological pyramid was being rebuilt, layer by layer, from the bottom up. By the late Triassic, roughly 220 to 201 million years ago, terrestrial ecosystems had achieved a level of complexity that rivaled, though did not yet match, the diverse late Permian world that had preceded them. The food webs were multi-layered, the ecological niches were being filled, and the diversity of vertebrate life was approaching pre-extinction levels. But it was a very different world from the Permian. The dominant large animals were now archosaurs, not synapsids. The dominant predators were roysuckians and early theropods, not gorgonopsians. The dominant large herbivores were rhynchosaurs and dicynodonts and prosauropod dinosaurs, not the periasaurs and large cassades of the Permian. The flying animals were pterosaurs, not insects alone. The coastal and aquatic environments were inhabited by ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs and nothosaurs, great marine reptiles that had colonized the ocean in the wake of the extinction of the marine fauna. This was a new world, built on the ruins of the old one, but following its own distinctive evolutionary trajectory. And it was a world in which the synapsid dynasty, though no longer dominant, still played important roles, still contributed to the ecological fabric of the living world, still maintained its tenuous presence in the face of increasing archosaur dominance. The balance was about to shift again. The end Triassic extinction, as we have discussed, would remove the last major synapsid competitors, clearing the way for the complete and final transition to dinosaurian dominance. But the synapsid legacy would not be erased. It would be carried forward, compressed into the tiny, furry bodies of the first mammals, preserved in amber and stone and bone, waiting for its time to come again. And now, let us explore a question that has been lurking at the edges of our story throughout both parts of this documentary. What does the story of the Permian synapsids tell us about the nature of biological dominance itself? What lessons can we draw from the rise and fall of the forgotten rulers of the earth? The first and most obvious lesson is one that we have already touched upon. Dominance is never permanent. No group of organisms, no matter how successful, no matter how well adapted, no matter how thoroughly it has colonized the available ecological space, can guarantee its own permanence. The synapsids were the dominant land vertebrates for tens of millions of years, through the Carboniferous and the Permian. They had achieved a level of ecological and physiological sophistication that, by any reasonable measure, should have assured their continued dominance. And yet they were brought low by a geological event entirely beyond their control or comprehension. The dinosaurs, in their turn, ruled for 165 million years, a tenure of dominance so long that it makes the entire history of human civilization look like a momentary footnote. And yet they too were brought down by an event beyond their control, an asteroid impact that reduced their world to fire and darkness. And the mammals, which rose from the ashes of the dinosaurian extinction to rule the modern world, are no more immune to the forces of change than their predecessors were. The history of life on Earth is a history of contingency, of unpredictable events reshuffling the deck and dealing new hands to the players in the game of survival. The second lesson is related to the first. Evolutionary success is always context-dependent. The synapsids were spectacularly successful in the world of the Permian, perfectly adapted to the ecological conditions of their time. The cynodonts, with their mammalian physiology and their complex teeth and their warm blood, were the most sophisticated land vertebrates the world had ever seen. But in the changed world of the early Triassic, their advantages were not sufficient to maintain their dominance. The archosaurs, with their different suite of adaptations, proved to be better suited to the conditions that prevailed after the extinction. The synapsids were not inferior creatures. They were creatures exquisitely adapted to a world that no longer existed. This is a profound and humbling insight. Success in one environment does not guarantee success in another. Adaptations that are highly advantageous under one set of conditions can become liabilities when those conditions change. Evolution always operates in the present tense, shaping organisms for the world as it currently is, with no ability to anticipate the world as it might become. When the world changes faster than evolution can respond, even the most successful lineages can find themselves suddenly, catastrophically out of step with their environment. The third lesson concerns the persistence of innovation. Although the synapsid dynasty was shattered by the Permian extinction and never regained its Permian-era prominence, the innovations that synapsids had developed were not lost. They were preserved in the surviving lineages and continued to be refined over subsequent millions of years. The mammalian warm-bloodedness, the complex dentition, the 3 middle ear bones, the enlarged brain, all of these innovations that the synapsids pioneered in the Permian and Triassic continued to develop and improve throughout the Mesozoic. And when the mammals finally emerged from the dinosaurian shadow 66 million years ago, they brought with them a biological toolkit of extraordinary sophistication, refined over hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary development. This persistence of innovation is a testament to the continuity of the evolutionary process. Evolution does not start from scratch with each new era. It builds on what came before, incorporating and refining the innovations of previous generations while adding new ones. The mammals of today are the product of 300 million years of accumulated evolutionary innovation, stretching back through the Dinosaurian era and the synapsid dynasties of the Permian to the very earliest amniotes of the Carboniferous. Every mammal alive today carries within its body the legacy of the forgotten rulers of the earth. The jaw mechanics that allow you to chew your food were developed by the therapsids of the Permian. The middle ear bones that allow you to hear were repurposed from the jaw bones of early cynodont ancestors. The warm blood that flows through your veins was pioneered by the most advanced Permian synapsids. The complex social behaviors, the parental care, the extended learning that characterizes mammalian life, all of these have their roots in the biological innovations of creatures that lived and died before the first dinosaur ever drew breath. This is perhaps the most important lesson of the entire story we have been telling. We are not separate from the deep history of life on Earth. We are part of it. We are its continuation. The thread of evolutionary continuity that connects us to the sail-backed Dimetrodon of the early Permian is unbroken, running through 300 million years of biological history, carrying the accumulated innovations and adaptations of uncountable generations of synapsid ancestors. When we look at a fossil of Dimetrodon or a gorgonopsian or a cynodont, we are not looking at alien creatures from a world that has nothing to do with us. We are looking at our relatives, our ancestors, the early chapters of our own story. Their struggles were our struggles, their innovations are our inheritance, their story is the beginning of our story, and their story is a story of extraordinary achievement. In a world so different from our own that it might seem to belong to another planet, the synapsids of the Permian built the first complex terrestrial ecosystems, developed the first sophisticated predator-prey relationships, pioneered the physiological innovations that would eventually give rise to the mammalian way of life, and ruled the land with an authority and a success that has never been equaled by any group before or since. They deserve to be remembered. They deserve to be celebrated. They deserve to be known. And yet, there is one more aspect of their story that we have not yet fully explored, one more dimension of the Permian world that deserves our attention before we bring this journey to a close. That is the extraordinary diversity of organisms that existed alongside the synapsids in the Permian world, the full community of creatures that made up the complex ecosystems of the supercontinent, and the way in which all of these organisms interacted to create a living world of remarkable richness and complexity. We have spent much of our time discussing the large, obvious animals, the apex predators, the mega herbivores, the large amphibians. But these visible, dramatic creatures were just the tip of the ecological iceberg. Beneath and around them, a vast world of smaller organisms was carrying out the fundamental biological processes that made the entire system work. The insects of the Permian were diverse and abundant, fulfilling the same essential roles that they play in modern ecosystems, pollinating plants, decomposing organic matter, serving as food for a vast array of vertebrate and invertebrate predators. Permian insects included giant dragonflies, primitive cockroaches, early beetles, and a host of other forms, many of them belonging to lineages that have since gone extinct and are known only from their fossils in Permian coal deposits. The soil of the Permian world was also teeming with life, though most of it was invisible to the naked eye. Bacteria and fungi were the primary decomposers, breaking down dead plant and animal matter and recycling the nutrients it contained back into the soil. Earthworms and other soil invertebrates helped to aerate and mix the soil, maintaining its fertility. Mycorrhizal fungi formed symbiotic relationships with plant roots, enhancing the plant's ability to absorb water and nutrients from the soil. This below-ground community was just as important to the functioning of Permian ecosystems as the spectacular megafauna that we have been discussing. Without healthy soil communities, the plants could not grow. Without plants, the herbivores could not survive. Without herbivores, the carnivores would have nothing to hunt. The entire elaborate edifice of the Permian food web rested on the invisible foundation of the soil community, and when the Permian mass extinction disrupted this foundation, the consequences rippled upward through every level of the ecosystem. The plants themselves were a critical component of the Permian world, and their diversity and distribution shaped the opportunities available to the animals that depended on them. The Permian saw significant changes in plant communities over the course of the period, with the coal swamp forests of the early Permian giving way to more open, seasonally dry vegetation dominated by seed plants in the later Permian. This shift in plant communities was driven by the increasingly arid conditions of the late Permian as the continental interior of Pangaea became drier and more extreme. The coal swamp plants, which required consistently wet conditions, retreated to the coasts and river valleys, replaced in the more arid interior by seed plants that could tolerate drought through adaptations like thick, waxy cuticles, deep root systems, and dormant seeds that could wait for favorable conditions before germinating. The changing plant communities of the late Permian had profound implications for the animals that depended on them. As the lush, wet forests of the early Permian gave way to more open, seasonally dry vegetation, the niches available for animals changed as well. The large, barrel-bodied cascades that had thrived in the abundant vegetation of the early Permian were less well suited to the drier, more seasonal conditions of the late Permian. The more diverse and physiologically sophisticated therapsids, with their better locomotion and their developing endothermy, were better able to exploit the patchy, variable food resources of the increasingly arid late Permian landscape. In this way, the environmental changes of the late Permian may have actually accelerated the evolution of advanced therapsid characteristics, driving the selection of more mammalian physiological traits by creating an environment where the advantages of warm-bloodedness and efficient locomotion were particularly pronounced. The world was changing, and the synapsids that were best equipped to handle that change were the ones moving most rapidly in the direction of the mammalian body plan. There is a beautiful irony in this observation. The very environmental deterioration that would ultimately culminate in the catastrophic Permian mass extinction may have been a key driver of the evolutionary innovations that allowed the synapsid lineage to survive that catastrophe and eventually give rise to the mammals. The worsening conditions of the late Permian were simultaneously destroying the old synapsid world and forging the biological tools that the survivors would need to build a new one. This is the paradox of adversity in evolution. Stress, challenge, and hardship can be powerful drivers of innovation, pushing organisms to develop new adaptations and strategies that would not be necessary in a comfortable, stable environment. The most significant evolutionary transitions in the history of life have often occurred in the context of environmental stress, as organisms were forced to adapt rapidly or face extinction. The synapsids of the late Permian were under enormous stress, and the most advanced of them responded with innovations of extraordinary creativity and consequence. Now let us consider one final aspect of our story, the element that ties together everything we have discussed and gives the narrative of the Permian synapsids its ultimate significance. The story of the forgotten rulers of the earth is, at its deepest level, a story about connectivity. About the way in which all living things are connected to each other through the shared inheritance of evolutionary history, and about the way in which the present is connected to the past through the unbroken thread of biological continuity. Every living organism on Earth today is the descendant of organisms that lived in the Permian world. Not every lineage survived the Great Dying, of course. Many went completely extinct, leaving no descendants. But those that did survive carried with them the genetic legacy of their Permian ancestors, and that legacy has been passed down, modified and refined by natural selection at every step, through all the subsequent eons of Earth history to the living world of the present. The bacteria in the soil, the plants that draw nourishment from it, the insects that pollinate those plants, the amphibians that catch those insects, the mammals that hunt those amphibians, and the apex predators that sit at the top of modern food webs, all of these are living connections to the Permian world. All of them descended from creatures that survived the most devastating catastrophe in the history of life and rebuilt the living world from the ashes. And we, the mammals, are among the most direct living connections to the Permian past. Our lineage has been continuous since the first synapsids appeared over 300 million years ago. We have passed through the fire of the Permian extinction and the long shadow of the Dinosaurian era without ever losing the thread of continuity that connects us to our ancient ancestors. We are, in a very real sense, the legacy of the Permian world, the living testament to the resilience and creativity and evolutionary genius of the forgotten rulers of the earth. When you feel the warmth of the sun on your skin and your body does not need to draw heat from that warmth to function, when you hear a sound and the tiny bones in your middle ear vibrate to transmit it to your brain, when you chew your food with teeth of different shapes serving different functions, you are experiencing, in your own body, the accumulated innovations of 300 million years of synapsid evolution. You are the living inheritance of creatures whose names you may never have heard, whose bodies you may never have imagined, but whose biological achievements are written into every cell of your body. That is the true significance of the story of the forgotten rulers of the earth. It is not just a story about ancient creatures in a distant past. It is a story about us, about where we came from, about the deep biological roots that connect us to the living world and to the long history of life on our planet. The gorgonopsians are gone, the cynodonts are gone, the dinosaurs are gone. The magnificent sail-backed Dimetrodon is gone, buried in the red rock of ancient riverbeds, preserved only as stone and silence. The world they built has been dismantled and remade so many times over the hundreds of millions of years since their passing that it is virtually unrecognizable. But they are not truly gone. They live on in us. They live on in every mammal that draws warm, oxygenated blood through its body, in every creature that nurses its young and teaches them the skills they need to survive, in every organism that looks out at the world with large, forward-facing eyes capable of judging distances with precision. They live on in the biological innovations they bequeath to their descendants, innovations that have been refined and perfected over hundreds of millions of years, but that began, improbably and miraculously, in the warm, arid landscapes of the Permian world. The world of the Permian is a world that can never be fully recaptured or completely understood. Too much time has passed. Too much has been lost, not just in the catastrophe of the Great Dying, but in the slow, inevitable processes of geological time, erosion, and metamorphism that have reduced most of the physical traces of that ancient world to rubble and dust. We know this world only through fragments, through bones and teeth and tracks and traces preserved by the improbable chance of fossilization, studied and interpreted by generations of scientists who have dedicated their lives to reconstructing the living world from these fragmentary clues. But even from these fragments, a picture emerges that is vivid and compelling and full of life. We can see Dimetrodon orienting its sail to the morning sun, warming its blood for the day's hunt. We can see a gorgonopsian closing in on a cynodont herd, its enormous canines gleaming in the dry Permian air. We can see a small cynodont nestled in its burrow, its warm blood and its fur keeping it comfortable through the cool of the night, while the cold-blooded reptiles above it on the surface are forced into stillness by the falling temperature. We can see these things because the people who study these fossils have reconstructed them for us, piece by piece, deduction by deduction, from the evidence preserved in the rock. And in doing so, they have given us a gift of incalculable value, the ability to look back across the abyss of time and see our origins, to recognize ourselves in the strange and ancient creatures that ruled the earth before the dinosaurs, to understand that the story of life on Earth is our story from its very beginning. The Permian world is gone, the forgotten rulers are long dead, the great supercontinent on which they lived has been broken and scattered across the globe, its pieces drifting on the slow conveyor belt of plate tectonics to their current positions. The seas that once surrounded Pangaea have been replaced by the modern oceans, filling different basins, following different currents, harboring different life, but the story endures. In the fossils, in the rocks, in the genes of every living mammal, the story of the Permian world endures. And in this documentary, in the 90 minutes or so that we have spent together traveling through the deep past, we have done our best to tell that story, to bring the forgotten rulers back to life for a brief shining moment, to honor their extraordinary achievements and acknowledge our debt to them. They were the first, they were the founders, they were the architects of the living world that exists today. Before the dinosaurs, before the birds, before the whales and the horses and the elephants and the primates, there were the synapsids of the Permian, ruling their supercontinent with an authority and a sophistication that we are only now beginning to fully appreciate. They are forgotten no longer. And as we step back from the edge of the Permian world and return to our own time, carrying with us the knowledge and the wonder of what we have seen, let us remember that the story of life on Earth is not finished. It continues, as it always has, driven by the same forces of natural selection and environmental change that drove it 300 million years ago. New dynasties will rise, old ones will fall. The world will continue to change, as it always has, and the living things that inhabit it will continue to adapt, to innovate, to find new ways of surviving and thriving in an ever-changing world. That is the nature of life. That is the miracle of evolution. That is the legacy of the forgotten rulers of the earth. The saga continues, the thread of life goes on, and somewhere in the future, perhaps hundreds of millions of years from now, creatures that we cannot imagine will look back at our own time and see in our bones and our genes the first faint traces of their own story, just as we look back at the Permian world and see ourselves. The age of synapsids stretched across tens of millions of years, from the late Carboniferous through the entire Permian, a dynasty of biological innovation and ecological dominance unmatched in the early history of land life. The creatures of this era, from the sail-backed pelycosaurs to the saber-toothed gorgonopsians to the small, warm-blooded cynodonts, were among the most remarkable animals that have ever lived. They established the template for complex terrestrial ecosystems. They pioneered the physiological innovations that would eventually define the mammalian way of life. They survived catastrophes that destroyed the vast majority of life on Earth and rebuilt the living world from the ashes. They are the forgotten rulers of the Earth, and now, in these pages in this documentary, they are forgotten no longer. The world they built was extraordinary. The world they lost was heartbreaking. And the world they left behind, the world that we live in today, carries their legacy in every breath we take, every sound we hear, every warm and living moment we experience. This is their gift to us across 300 million years of time, and it is a gift beyond measure. Thank you for joining us on this extraordinary journey through the deep history of life on Earth. The story of the Permian synapsids, the forgotten rulers who came before the dinosaurs, is one of the most remarkable and least appreciated chapters in the long saga of life on our planet. We hope that this documentary has given you a new appreciation for these ancient creatures and for the deep biological roots that connect all living things to the distant past. Please share this documentary with anyone who you think would be interested in this fascinating chapter of Earth's history, and join us next time for another journey into the deep past.